Victor Harlan didn't look at her when he said it. That was the part Evelyn Carter never forgot. Not the words themselves, though they were ugly enough, but the way he kept his eyes on the crowd, one thumb hooked in his vest pocket, speaking loud enough for every merchant and mother and child at the Black Hollow Autumn Market to hear. Somebody ought to tell the fat widow to go home. She's making the whole row look sad. A few people laughed. Most just looked away. Evelyn's hands went still on her breadcloth. She didn't cry. She'd learned years ago that crying in front of men like Victor Harland only gave them something to talk about longer. She just stood there and kept breathing. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who never even bothered to learn your name, if you've ever been made to feel like your presence alone was an inconvenience, then you already know exactly what Evelyn felt in that moment. This is her story. And if it moves you, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Because the stories we tell here don't end the way people expect. Drop a like and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it really began. The morning of the Black Hollow Harvest Market started the way most hard mornings did for Evelyn Carter, before sunrise, with her hands already in flour. She'd been up since 4. The bread dough had been resting since the night before. 2 batches of cinnamon pull-apart, 1 plain sourdough, a full tray of apple hand pies she'd been awake half the night crimping closed. She worked by lamplight in the small rented room above the feed store on Caldwell Street, the only space she could afford since losing the bakery 18 months ago. The oven was a cast-iron wood stove that ran too hot on the left side and not hot enough on the right, and she'd learned to compensate by rotating her pans every 15 minutes, whether the recipe called for it or not. She wasn't thinking about the market yet. She was thinking about the dough. That was how she got through things. 1 task at a time, 1 hour at a time. You didn't think about the whole mountain when you were just trying to put your boot on. By 6 in the morning, she had everything loaded into the back of the borrowed wagon. Her neighbor Dora Inglis had lent it without being asked, just left the key on Evelyn's doorstep the night before with a note that said, "Good luck. Don't argue about the horse." Evelyn had read it twice and then folded it into her apron pocket where it stayed all day. The drive into town took 40 minutes on the frost-hardened road. Black Hollow was not a beautiful place in October. The hills around it had gone gray and stripped, and the wind came off the northern range with a kind of personal hostility, finding every gap in a coat collar, every loose button, every set of cold ears. Evelyn wore her dead husband's wool scarf because it was the warmest thing she owned, and because she'd stopped caring what people thought about a woman who wore men's clothing. James had been gone 2 years now. She didn't think about James when she could help it. Not because she had stopped loving him, but because loving someone who wasn't there anymore was like pressing on a bruise to make sure it still hurt. It always did. You didn't need to keep checking. The market was already setting up when she arrived. She recognized most of the merchants, the Kellner family with their stacked jars of preserved vegetables, old Pete Strawn selling leather goods from the back of his cart, the Dawson sisters with their quilts hung like flags between 2 posts. There was a whole row of food sellers running down the center of the market square, and that was where Evelyn had been assigned her spot, at the far eastern end, which was the polite way of saying the forgotten end, where foot traffic thinned out and the shade came early. She didn't complain. She set up her table without help, laid out her cloth, arranged the bread and pies in the best order she could manage, and stood behind it with her hands folded in front of her and her chin level. The market opened at 8. By 9:30, she had sold 2 pies. She watched families move through the row. They stopped at the Kellner table, at the Dawson sisters, at a woman 3 spots down who was selling ginger snap cookies shaped like autumn leaves. They slowed and smiled and reached for things and handed over coins. At Evelyn's table, most of them slowed just enough to glance, and then kept walking. She knew what they were seeing. A heavy-set woman in a plain coat, no sign painted bright enough to catch the eye, no husband standing beside her to make the whole thing seem legitimate in the way that frontier towns still required a man's presence to make a woman's effort respectable. She knew what they were seeing because she'd seen herself in enough windows and mirrors to know exactly what picture she made. She adjusted the pies. She straightened the breadcloth. She smiled at a child who stopped to look and whose mother pulled her gently by the hand without stopping. 10 o'clock. 11. She sold 3 more pies. One loaf of the plain sourdough to an older man who didn't look at her face. She watched her apple hand pies sitting untouched in their row, golden and perfect, each one crimped with the small twist at the corner that James had always said looked like a crown. She was not going to think about James. A group of merchants from the main row walked past her table sometime near noon. There were 4 of them, men who ran the hardware store, the mill, the dry goods, and Victor Harland in the middle, who ran everything else. Victor was a tall man, not fat, but thick through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and knew it, and had decided to coast on the memory of it. He wore a good hat and a coat with a fur collar, and he moved through the market the way men who own things move, like the ground beneath them belonged to them personally. Evelyn had known Victor Harland for 6 years. Or she'd known of him. Before James died, when the Carter bakery was still operating and doing well enough that people stopped in every morning for bread, and Evelyn was simply the baker's wife. And then the baker, Victor Harland, had never noticed her enough to be cruel. She was invisible to men like him then, which in retrospect had been a kind of protection. After James died and the bakery started to struggle, she'd gone to Victor's land company to inquire about a small commercial loan, just enough to get through the winter and stock enough flour to carry her to spring. She hadn't needed much. She'd had a plan. She'd written it out on 2 pages of paper and brought it with her. He hadn't read it. He'd looked at her the way people looked at problems they wanted to disappear, and he'd said he didn't see how a woman alone could run a serious business, and he'd wished her luck in a tone that meant the opposite. And she'd walked out of his office and stood on the wooden sidewalk outside for 4 full minutes before her legs agreed to carry her anywhere. 3 months later, rumors started in Black Hollow. She never found out exactly how they started or who first said the words out loud, but the story that spread through town was that the Carter bakery used spoiled flour, that Evelyn cut corners on her recipes, that a woman operating alone without oversight couldn't be trusted to maintain proper standards. The rumors were specific enough to sound like they came from someone who knew things. They were vague enough that no one could be directly contradicted. By spring, her regular customers had mostly stopped coming in. By summer, she couldn't pay the rent on the shop. By August, she'd sold the equipment and given up the space. She never proved Victor Harland had started those rumors. She never tried to. She had no lawyer, no connections, and no capital for a fight she wasn't certain she could win. She packed what she could into storage, moved into the rented room above the feed store, and started over with nothing but her hands and whatever flour she could afford week by week. That was 18 months ago. Now she was standing at the end of a market row with a table full of bread no one was stopping to buy, and Victor Harland was walking past with his hands in his coat pockets and his voice carried on the October wind. Somebody ought to tell the fat widow to go home. She heard it. She knew he knew she heard it. That was probably part of it. Not saying it to her directly, which would require acknowledging her as a person worth speaking to, but saying it just loud enough, just carelessly enough, that it could almost be written off as private conversation if anyone called him on it. Nobody called him on it. The men with him made sounds that might have been laughs. Victor moved on. He didn't look back. Evelyn stood very still for a moment. She was aware of her hands on the breadcloth, of the cold coming off the ground, of the sound of the market continuing all around her as though nothing had happened. Because for most people here, nothing had. A man had said something unkind. That was not news. That was just Tuesday. She breathed in through her nose. She breathed out through her mouth. She picked up the small bread knife she used for samples, and she cut a clean slice from the cinnamon pull-apart and set it on a square of cloth at the front of the table. If she was going home, she was going home having tried everything. The slice sat there for 10 minutes, and no one took it. She cut another one. This was the part nobody told you about survival, that it wasn't heroic. It wasn't a moment where the music swelled and you found your backbone and everything clarified into purpose. It was just standing at a table in the cold cutting bread slices that nobody wanted, telling yourself you were going to finish the day because quitting in the middle of it was worse than whatever came at the end. She had gotten very good at that kind of stubbornness. James used to call it her best quality and her most infuriating one in the same breath. She was on her 3rd slice, and she was beginning to make the quiet calculations she'd been dreading all morning. How much the unsold goods weighed, how much the return trip would cost, how much she'd cleared minus expenses, and whether it was enough to justify what she'd spent on sugar and cinnamon. When she heard Boots stop in front of her table, she looked up. The man standing there was not someone she recognized immediately, though she'd seen him before at a distance the way you saw certain men at a distance in a small territory. Present enough to be familiar, private enough to stay unintroduced. He was somewhere in his middle 40s, not tall, built economically, the kind of frame that looked like it had been doing real work since about the age of 12 and had stopped apologizing for it. He wore a coat that had been good quality 5 years ago and hadn't been replaced because the man wearing it didn't particularly care about that kind of thing. His hat was plain. His boots were dirty in the way that working boots were dirty, not the kind of dirty that came from walking through a market, but the deep-set kind that no amount of brushing quite got out. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the bread. Specifically, he was looking at the cinnamon pull-apart, the way a person looked at something they recognized from a long time ago and hadn't expected to see again. Not hungry exactly. More like careful. Like he was trying to decide if it was real. "Can I?" he said, nodding at the slice on the cloth. "That's what it's there for," Evelyn said. He picked it up and ate it in 2 bites, and then he stood very still for a moment in the way that people stood still when something tasted like a memory they hadn't been thinking about. He looked at the remaining loaf. He looked at the apple hand pies. He looked at the sourdough. "How much for everything?" he said. Evelyn thought she'd misheard him. "I'm sorry?" "Everything on the table." He said it the way people said things they'd already decided. "How much?" She looked at what was left. 2 cinnamon pull-aparts, the sourdough, 11 apple hand pies, 4 smaller rolls she'd almost left at home because they'd gone slightly darker on top than she'd intended. She did the arithmetic in her head. The honest arithmetic, not the desperate arithmetic, because she'd promised herself years ago that she wouldn't sell herself short just because someone offered. She told him the number. He didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and counted the bills out onto the table, adding a small amount extra that she didn't comment on, and then he began carefully stacking the goods into the wooden carrying crate he'd apparently brought for the purpose. "You came to the market planning to buy bread," Evelyn said. It wasn't quite a question. "I came to the market for a few things." He set the last pie into the crate without looking up. "Found what I needed." She watched him arrange the items with the same economy of motion he'd used for everything else. Nothing wasted, nothing showy. "I don't believe I know your name," she said. "Nathan Cole." He straightened up and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were the kind of gray that changed depending on the light and weren't particularly remarkable in themselves, but they had the quality of actually looking at things, which was rarer than people assumed. "You're Evelyn Carter. You know me. I know your bread." A small pause. "I also know what Harlan did to your bakery." The words landed quietly, and she let them land without reaction because she'd had practice at that. "A lot of people know that story," she said. "Most of them find it confirms something they already believed." "I find it confirms that you kept baking," he said. "That's the part I'm more interested in." She didn't know what to do with that. She picked up the breadcloth and folded it, more to have something to do with her hands than because it needed folding. "Well," she said, "thank you for stopping." "I have a proposition," Nathan Cole said, "if you're willing to hear it." She looked at him. He wasn't smiling, wasn't performing generosity the way men sometimes did when they were offering something they expected to be thanked elaborately for. He looked like a man who'd thought something through and arrived at a practical conclusion. "Speak it then," Evelyn said. "I run a cattle operation north of here, Coal Ridge Ranch. 12 men, myself included, living and working there year-round. We've been without a proper cook for 4 months. The man we had broke his wrist and went back to Missouri. Before him, a younger fellow who couldn't be trusted with fire and burned 2 pots before I let him go. He wasn't embellishing. He was reporting facts. What I've been eating since July is not something I'd describe to company. And I want someone who can cook. Actually cook. Not heat things in a pan and call it a meal." He looked at the now empty table. "That bread is the best I've had since I was a boy in Ohio. That's not flattery. I don't waste time on flattery." "I don't doubt it," Evelyn said. She studied him. "What are the terms?" "Room and board. Your own quarters. A fair wage. I'll name a number and you can counter if you think it's wrong. You run the kitchen as you see fit. I don't interfere with how a thing gets done when it gets done correctly." He said it all at one steady pace, the terms already arranged in his head. "The work is hard. The men aren't difficult, but they're not easy either. They've spent 4 months eating badly, which makes anyone irritable. The kitchen itself is going to need work. How much work? Some. She understood that some was doing considerable labor in that sentence. And you're offering this to a woman you've spoken to for 4 minutes. I'm offering it to someone who can make cinnamon bread that good in a rented room on a wood stove, he said. In my experience, people who do good work in bad conditions generally do better work when conditions improve. I'm a practical man, Mrs. Carter. I'm not interested in someone's story. I'm interested in what they can do. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Around them, the market continued. She could hear the Dawson sisters laughing at something 2 rows over, the sound of horse hooves on packed ground, the particular thin quality of cold weather noise that carried farther than it meant to. She thought about the rented room. She thought about the wood stove that burned too hot on the left. She thought about the arithmetic she'd been doing in her head all morning and what it added up to, and what it added up to the month after, and the month after that. She thought about Victor Harlan saying fat widow into the October air and moving on like she wasn't even worth the full moment of cruelty. I'll need to see the kitchen before I agree to anything, she said. Nathan nodded like that was exactly the correct answer. I can have you there by evening. She looked at her empty table. She looked at the folded breadcloth in her hands. She'd come to this market with everything she had left, and a man she'd never properly met had bought all of it in 40 seconds. She said yes. The drive to Coal Ridge Ranch took the better part of 2 hours on roads that made the morning's drive to market feel like a luxury. Nathan Cole drove the way he did everything else, steadily, without comment, not filling silence with noise just because silence existed. Evelyn sat beside him with her hands in her lap and watched the terrain change from the flat land around Black Hollow into the rougher country to the north, hills rising and then the first suggestion of mountains beyond, the sky going pale and enormous overhead. She'd grown up in Indiana, in a town where the horizon was always blocked by something. Montana's sky still startled her sometimes. How long has the ranch been running? She asked, somewhere in the second hour. 12 years, Nathan said. I came out from Ohio in '77. Bought the land for less than it was worth from a man who'd decided the frontier wasn't for him. Built the house first, then the cattle operation. It's about 2,200 acres now. You built the house yourself? Most of it. A few of the hands helped with the roof. He glanced at the road. I'm not much for things I can't put my hands on. She thought about that. The men who work for you, how long have they been there? Longest is a man named Calhoun, been with me 9 years. Others come and go. Ranching's not a life that keeps everyone. He paused. They're good men. They work hard and they don't cause trouble. They also haven't had a decent meal since July, and some of them are starting to take it personally. What does that mean personally? They've started arguing at the table, he said, not about anything that matters. Just the way men argue when they're not eating right and they're tired and there's nothing to put their mood on that's reasonable, so they put it on each other. He said it without judgment, like he was describing weather. A kitchen that works makes a household that works. I've seen it enough times to know it's not superstition. Evelyn thought about that. She'd seen it too. In her bakery, the way the morning regulars who'd come in for bread before work arrived tight-shouldered and left easier, and how that had nothing to do with the bread specifically and everything to do with what it meant to have something reliable waiting for you. What happened to the man before the one who burned the pots? She asked. He was a fair cook, moved on after 2 years to try his luck in the territories further west. A pause. He was also the type who kept himself to himself. Wouldn't have learned any of their names if you'd paid him. That matters to you? It matters to the ranch, Nathan said. There's a difference between people who do a job and people who understand what the job is part of. Feeding 12 men in an isolated working ranch isn't the same as cooking dinner. It's keeping something together that could fall apart without it. Evelyn looked at the road unrolling ahead of them. The light was going low and golden and cold, the kind of light that made everything look briefly significant. She thought, this man is not simple. She did not say it out loud. The ranch came into view around dusk, not dramatically, but practically, the way things appeared in open country. A cluster of structures first as dark shapes, then as specific things. A main house that was larger than she'd expected, built of good timber, functional rather than ornate. A long bunkhouse to the east. A barn, several outbuildings, a corral with horses she could hear before she could see. Several of the ranch hands were visible in the yard as the wagon pulled in, doing the end-of-day tasks that looked the same on every working ranch. Putting equipment away, checking the horses, the particular purposeful movement of people wrapping up hard work. They looked up when the wagon arrived. They looked at Evelyn. She'd expected this. She kept her expression neutral and made a note of each face without making it obvious she was doing so. It was something she'd learned in the bakery. The first impression you gave wasn't always the one that mattered most, but it was the hardest one to undo. A man came down from the porch. He was the oldest in the yard by visible measure, maybe 60, with the reddened face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors and the careful way of moving that said his joints had opinions about the temperature. He looked at Nathan, then at Evelyn, then back at Nathan. "This the cook?" he said. "Evelyn Carter," Nathan said. "She'll be running the kitchen. Evelyn, this is Amos Calhoun. He's been here the longest." Calhoun looked at her directly, which she appreciated. Not the sideways assessing look some men gave, but a straight-on considering one. "You actually know what you're doing in a kitchen?" he said. Not rude, practical. "I've been feeding people since I was 14, Evelyn said. "Ask me something specific if you want a useful answer." Something shifted in Calhoun's face. Not warmth exactly, but the particular expression of a man recalibrating. "Fair enough," he said. He looked at Nathan. "The others are going to have questions." "They can ask them at dinner," Nathan said. She saw a few of the other hands exchange glances. The kind of glance that meant dinner and questions were concepts that didn't naturally go together in this yard. Nathan showed her the kitchen. She'd been right that some was working hard in his description. The kitchen occupied the back half of the main house's ground floor, a large space that had clearly once been functional and had, over the course of 4 months of being managed by men who didn't know what they were doing in it, become a kind of considered disaster. The stove was good, a proper range with 4 burners and a reliable oven, better than anything she'd had in months. But it hadn't been properly cleaned in a while, and there was a residue on the grates that was going to require serious attention. The shelving was half organized, half abandoned. Someone had stacked the flour and the cornmeal in the same unlabeled sacks and left them side by side, which was the kind of decision that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what flour was for. The cutting table was solid but scarred, and someone had left a coffee pot soaking in the wash basin that had been there long enough to need its own cleaning. The supply stores were better than she'd feared. Nathan had clearly kept them reasonably stocked even without a real cook. He was not a man who let the practical foundations of a place collapse if he could help it. There was decent salt pork, a barrel of dried beans, potatoes and onions in the cold cellar, cornmeal in quantity. And on a high shelf she found 3 cans of something that turned out, when she opened them later, to be good quality peach preserves that someone had clearly been saving for an occasion that hadn't arrived. "Well," she said. Nathan was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, watching her do her assessment. "Well," he agreed. "The stove is fine," she said. "I'll need 2 days to get the kitchen itself right before I can cook in it properly. In the meantime, I can work around the condition it's in, but the food won't be what it should be until it is." "Whatever you need," he said. "What I said about interfering with how it gets done, I mean it. This is your space." She looked at him. "I haven't had a space of my own in a 1.5 years," she said. He didn't say anything soft about that. He just nodded once, like he understood it was a fact and not a request for sympathy, which was exactly the right response. "I'll have something on the table in 2 hours," she said. "Not my best work, but better than what they've been eating." "That's a low bar," Nathan said. "Then I'll clear it easily," she said. He almost smiled. She wasn't sure. He turned and left the kitchen, and she was alone in the space that was now hers, and she stood in the middle of it for a moment with her hands at her sides. She thought, "This is either the best decision you've made in 2 years, or a different kind of mistake than the ones you've been making. Either way, she was here." She picked up the coffee pot from the basin and got to work. She made a large pot of soup that first evening, beans and salt pork with the onions, simple and hearty, stretched with enough hot water to fill the big pot completely, and seasoned with what she found on the shelves, which included good black pepper and dried thyme, and something she identified as sage that someone had clearly bought without knowing what to do with it. She made cornbread in the oven, plain, a double batch, because she'd learned years ago that bread on a table changed the quality of a meal independent of everything else. It gave people's hands something to do and their attention somewhere to rest. She had the food on the table at 8 o'clock. 12 men came in for it. She watched them the way she always watched new rooms, noting who deferred to who sat where without being told, who came in quiet and who came in loud, who looked at the food with hope and who looked at it with suspicion. Calhoun sat at the far end and said nothing. A young man, she'd learn later his name was Tommy Briggs, not yet 20, from somewhere in Kansas, sat near the middle and ate with the focus of someone who'd been seriously hungry for longer than a few hours. None of them said much. They ate. The soup went fast. The cornbread faster. A man named Dwyer, broad-shouldered and somewhere in his 30s, mopped the last of his soup with a piece of cornbread and said to no one in particular, "That's the first real meal I've had since August." Nobody answered him, but nobody disagreed. After the meal, when the men had filed back out and she was cleaning up, Calhoun came back in. He stood at the edge of the kitchen the same way Nathan did, in the doorway, not presuming to enter without acknowledgement. "You do something to this cornbread?" he said. "Browned the butter before I added it," she said. "Most people don't bother." He nodded slowly. "My wife used to do that," he said. And then, before she could respond, he turned and walked out. Evelyn was quiet for a moment after he left. She put the last of the cleaned bowls on the shelf. She stood at the kitchen window for a minute, looking at the dark yard beyond, the shapes of the outbuildings against the sky, the light from the bunkhouse windows where the men were settling in for the night. She thought, a year and a half since she'd had anything to hold on to. She thought, maybe. She turned back to the kitchen and started making a list for tomorrow. The first week was not smooth. She'd known it wouldn't be. She'd been in enough new situations to understand that the first week of anything was mainly about finding the real shape of what you'd agreed to, which was always somewhat different from the shape it looked like from the outside. Coleridge Ranch's real shape was this: 12 men who had been left to manage without proper support for long enough that they'd developed systems to compensate, and those systems were wrong in specific and entrenched ways. And the fact that something better was now available did not automatically make anyone willing to abandon what they'd built to cope. The food supplies were organized badly, and she reorganized them the second morning before anyone was up, labeling the sacks and grouping the dry goods and moving the preserved items to where they'd be accessible without climbing. Calhoun came in and saw what she'd done and said nothing, which she took as cautious approval. A younger hand named Percy came into the kitchen looking for coffee at 6 in the morning and found the pot on the right burner instead of the left, where it had apparently lived for 4 months. And he looked at it with the particular expression of a man confronting a change in something small and being obscurely bothered by it. "Coffee's still coffee," Evelyn said. Percy took his cup without answering. She learned their names by the end of the third day. Not because anyone introduced themselves formally. Nathan had made the introductions the first morning, brief and practical, each man's name and main role, nothing else. But because she paid attention to how they spoke to each other, how they moved, what they asked for when they came into the kitchen and how they asked for it. Tommy Briggs asked for everything apologetically, like each request was an imposition he'd already decided to feel bad about. A man named Harker, who ran the horses, asked for things bluntly but said thank you with complete sincerity each time, which counted for more than most people's elaborate manners. An older hand called Bo never asked for anything at all, just waited at the edge of the kitchen until she noticed him, which she found both tactful and slightly exhausting. By the fourth day, she had the kitchen operating the way she wanted it, clean, organized, with a schedule she'd laid out in her head that accounted for the demands of a working ranch day. Breakfast at 5:30, main meal at noon, supper at 7. Coffee available continuously. If a man came in at odd hours needing something, there would generally be something there for him without having to make a production of it. The food got better as she settled in. She'd known it would. The first days had been about learning the stove, learning the stores, learning what quantities actually worked for 12 large hungry men versus her instincts from feeding smaller numbers. By the end of the week, she was finding her rhythm, and the evidence was in the way the table sounded at meals, or more precisely, the way it didn't sound. The absence of the low-level irritable friction Nathan had described, men not arguing about things that didn't matter because they were eating well, and that took a certain kind of edge off the world. Nathan watched this without comment, the way he watched most things. On Friday of the first week, he came into the kitchen at an hour when it was empty except for her, at afternoon when the men were all out and she was prepping for supper, and he poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter and said, "Calhoun said something to me." "What did he say?" Evelyn said, not looking up from the potatoes she was cutting. "He said he thinks you might be the best cook he's ever eaten." She looked up at that. Nathan's expression was careful, not giving away whether he was the kind of man who repeated compliments easily or whether this one had meant something specific to him to pass along. "He doesn't say things like that," he added. "In 9 years, I've heard him compliment maybe 3 things." "What were the other 2?" she said. A genuine pause, like he was actually considering it. "A horse," he said, "and a fence post." She laughed. She hadn't expected to, and it came out a little unguarded, and Nathan looked at her when it did. Not in the way people looked at a surprise exactly, but the way they looked when something confirmed something they'd been quietly thinking. "You don't laugh much," he said. "I haven't had a lot of occasion," she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He left without making anything of it. She went back to her potatoes, and she thought about the fence post, and she found she was still smiling when she set the table for supper. The trouble, when it found her, didn't announce itself. That was the way it had always come, not as a dramatic confrontation, not as something she could see and prepare for, but as a shift in the quality of the air around her, a change in the way certain people spoke when they thought she wasn't quite listening. She'd been at Coal Ridge Ranch for 3 weeks when she first heard the name again. It was Calhoun who told her, and he told her straight, which she'd come to understand was his only way of doing things. "Man named Harland was in town," he said. He'd come in for the afternoon coffee and found her alone in the kitchen. He set his cup down and looked at it. Asking about you." Evelyn kept her hands still. "Asking what?" "Asking how you came to be here, how you knew Nathan, whether there was—" Calhoun stopped. He was not a man who found euphemism comfortable. Whether there was anything improper in the arrangement. She absorbed this. It was, of course, the obvious move. She'd known Victor Harlan long enough to understand his methods. He didn't fight directly if he could fight through implication. The suggestion that something improper existed between a widowed woman and the ranch owner she worked for was not a specific accusation. It couldn't be countered specifically. But it was the kind of rumor that traveled fast in frontier communities where reputation was currency and women had less of it to spend. "Who was he asking?" she said. "Merchant named Tipton, a few others." Calhoun paused. "Tipton has a loud mouth and poor judgment. By now the question has probably become a story." She breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth. "Nathan knows?" she said. "Not yet." Calhoun looked at her directly. "I thought you should hear it from me first." She thought, 18 months ago she'd heard the same kind of thing from no one first. Just absorbed it slowly as customers stopped coming, as the room changed texture around her, as the structure of her life was dismantled by a story she never got to answer. She thought, not this time. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." Calhoun picked up his coffee cup. He drank from it. He set it down. "Woman did me a kindness once," he said, in a tone that indicated the subject was connected to this one without elaborating how. "I remember that kind of thing." He walked out. Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter with the afternoon light coming through the window and the smell of what was going to be supper already in the air, and she thought about Victor Harland in a merchant's shop, asking questions with the particular careful imprecision of a man who wanted to start a fire without holding the match. She'd let him do it to her once. She wasn't going to let him do it again. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to find Nathan Cole. She found him at the corral fence, watching Harker work with one of the younger horses. She came to stand beside him at the fence, and she told him what Calhoun had told her, plainly, without embellishment, the same way Nathan told things. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, watching the horse. "You know this man," he said. Not a question. "He's the one who destroyed my bakery," she said. "He'll do the same here if he can, not because of anything I've done, because my being successful proved something he decided wasn't true." Nathan looked at the horse. Then he turned and looked at her. "You didn't ask me what I plan to do about it," he said. "I came to tell you, not to ask you to manage it," she said. "It involves your ranch and your name. You had a right to know." He studied her for a moment. That same quality of attention he'd given to the bread at the market, like he was looking at something he wanted to understand rather than just react to. "What do you plan to do about it?" he said. Evelyn looked at the horse in the corral, the young one, still learning where its feet went, still working out trust in increments. "I'm going to cook the best supper I've ever made," she said. "And then I'm going to be here tomorrow and do it again. And I'm going to keep being here until the story runs out of air." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "That's a sound plan," he said. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen. She had potatoes to finish. The potatoes were done by the time she got back to the kitchen, which meant she was behind, which meant she had to move faster than she liked to move when she was thinking about something else. That was the discipline of it. The kitchen didn't care what was happening outside the kitchen. The stove needed tending whether or not Victor Harland was in town spreading stories about her. The bread needed its time whether or not she was afraid. She'd learned that in the worst months after James died, when getting out of bed felt like something requiring a separate decision from actually standing up. The work didn't wait, and the work not waiting was, in its way, a mercy. It gave her somewhere to put herself when she didn't know where else to go. She got supper on the table at 7. Salt pork braised low with onions and dried apples she'd found in the cold cellar, a pot of beans that had been going since morning, cornbread again, but with cracked pepper stirred into the batter this time, and the peach preserve she'd found on the high shelf, opened and set out in a jar because there was no occasion worth waiting for that was worth more than right now. The men came in tired and sat down and ate. Tommy Briggs looked at the peach preserves and then looked at her and then back at the preserves like he was confirming they were real. "Where'd those come from?" he said. "High shelf," Evelyn said. "Those have been up there for 2 years," said Dwyer. "Henderson put them up there the week before he left and told us they were for special occasions." "This is a special occasion," Evelyn said. "What occasion?" "Tuesday," she said. "Tuesday's enough." Dwyer looked at the jar for a moment, and then he spooned some onto his bread, and his face did something that wasn't quite a smile but was close to one, which she was beginning to understand was the closest Dwyer got. She watched the table while she cleaned the pots. She watched the way they talked to each other, less brittle than the first week, less of that particular friction of men crowded together without enough comfort between them to absorb the day's weight. Tommy had stopped apologizing every time he reached for the breadbasket. Parker had started asking the man beside him questions about his day, real questions, the kind that required actual answers. Calhoun sat at the end of the table and didn't talk much, but he ate everything on his plate and poured his coffee himself and refilled it without being asked, which Evelyn had decided was his version of contentment. She thought, this is what Nathan meant. Not the food itself, what the food made room for. Nathan was at the other end of the table from Calhoun, not quite at the head. He'd made a point of not sitting at the head, she'd noticed, which was a specific choice for a man who owned everything in the room. Eating the same meal as everyone else, not saying much. He caught her eye once across the kitchen, and she looked away first, not quickly, but steadily, the way you looked away from something you needed to think about before you looked at it again. After supper, when the others had gone out, he came to the kitchen doorway. He did that. Came to the doorway, waited. Like the kitchen had a boundary he respected without being told it was there. "Calhoun's right," he said. She was washing the big pot. "About what specifically?" "You're the best cook he's ever eaten," he said it matter-of-factly. "He's eaten in a lot of places." "The fence post was a high standard to compete with," she said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. She wasn't looking at him, so she couldn't be certain. "I meant to say earlier," he said. "What I said about managing Harland, you were right to tell me the way you did. Most people would have come asking for something." "I don't want anything managed for me," she said. She kept washing. "I've had enough of that kind of help, the kind that makes the problem smaller by making you smaller along with it." "I know," Nathan said. "Do you?" A pause. "My mother ran a dry goods store in Ohio for 11 years after my father died," he said. "Every year some man or another offered to help her manage it. She thanked every one of them and then she managed it herself, better than any of them would have." He shifted in the doorway. "She also told me once that the worst thing people do to women who are capable is offer them a smaller version of what they're already doing and call it assistance." Evelyn stopped washing. She turned and looked at him. He was leaning against the frame in his usual way, not performing the speech he'd just made, just standing there the way he always stood, like he'd said a true thing and expected nothing particular in return for it. "She sounds like a sensible woman," Evelyn said. "She was," he said. "She would have liked your cornbread." He left. Evelyn turned back to the pot and finished washing it, and she thought about a woman in Ohio running a dry goods store for 11 years. And she thought it was possible she understood now one reason why Nathan Cole had stopped at her table when no one else had. October became November, and with November came the serious cold. The ranch changed shape in the cold. The days shortened, the outdoor work condensed, and the men were inside more, which meant the kitchen was the center of everything in a way it hadn't quite been in the milder weeks. They came in from early morning chores with cold in their hands and their faces, and stood near the stove without asking, just absorbing the heat, and Evelyn let them, because it cost nothing, and because she understood cold in her bones in a particular way after 18 months in a rented room with bad insulation and a stove that didn't hold heat past midnight. She learned them better as the weather drove them closer together. Calhoun she'd understood from the first week, a man who'd been doing things the same way for a long time and had good reasons for most of it, and who gave his approval slowly and couldn't be rushed on that. But he was fair, genuinely fair, in a way that was rarer than it should have been. When two of the younger hands had an argument one morning about whose turn it was to haul water, Calhoun had settled it in 4 sentences, not by declaring anyone right, but by making the arrangement going forward so clear that there was nothing left to argue about. He didn't explain himself after. He just went back to his coffee. Tommy Briggs was 21, she'd established, though he seemed younger in some ways and older in others. He'd come to Montana from Kansas after his family's farm failed, the second time in 3 years they'd tried to rebuild and couldn't. He didn't talk about this directly. She'd pieced it together from fragments, the way you pieced most things together. But it sat on him in the particular way that failure sat on young people who'd expected to be further along by now. He was good with the horses, Harker told her one morning, genuinely gifted in the way some people were gifted with animals, which was its own kind of intelligence that the world didn't always recognize as such. One afternoon, she found him sitting at the kitchen table outside mealtime, not eating, just sitting with his hands wrapped around an empty cup, looking at the far wall. She didn't say anything at first. She got the coffee pot from the stove and filled his cup without commenting on the fact that it was empty, and she went back to what she'd been doing. After a minute, he said, "My mother used to make pie on Fridays." "What kind?" Evelyn said. "Apple, mostly, sometimes rhubarb in summer." He looked at the cup. "She had a way of doing the crust where it came out. I don't know how to describe it. Not too hard. Not soft either." "Lard instead of butter," Evelyn said. "And cold water, added a little at a time. You can't rush pie crust. Most people do." He was quiet. "Hers was the best I've ever had." "Then she was a real baker," Evelyn said. "That's not a small thing." He looked up at her then, briefly, like someone checking that a thing was real before they let themselves believe it. "She died last spring," he said. "Fever." Evelyn kept her hands on what she was doing. She didn't turn it into a moment, didn't put down her work and make it a formal thing, because she understood instinctively that wasn't what he needed. "I'm sorry," she said. "Losing a mother there's not a right way to do it." "No," he said. "She'd want to know you're eating," Evelyn said. He almost smiled at that. "She'd want to know I'm eating something better than whatever Harker's been cooking." Harker was cooking? Harker was attempting cooking, Tommy said, with the tone of someone who'd survived a trauma they could now almost find funny. Once he made cornmeal that he described as porridge, and I would describe as moral injury. Evelyn laughed, and Tommy did too, and it was the first time she'd heard him laugh without it trailing off into apology at the end. She made apple pie that Friday. She didn't announce it. She just put it on the table with supper and let it be what it was. Tommy didn't say anything when he saw it. He just looked at it for a moment with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who'd been given back something they hadn't expected to get back. And then he served himself a piece and ate it quietly, and that was enough. The travelers started coming in the 4th week. She hadn't anticipated this, though in retrospect she should have. Nathan had told her that word traveled in frontier territory faster than people assumed, that in a country where reliable food and rest were scarce, good food specifically was the kind of news that moved of its own momentum. She'd thought he was being theoretical. He was not being theoretical. The first ones were a family passing through on the road north, a man, his wife, and two children in a wagon that had seen considerable mileage. They pulled into the ranch yard mid-afternoon, and the man came to the door asking if they might water the horses and rest an hour before moving on. Nathan said yes, as he apparently always did, because he was the kind of man who said yes to that question, and Evelyn put out bread and cold meat and a pot of coffee. The wife came inside while her husband handled the horses. She was a thin, tired woman with a quality of alertness that exhaustion hadn't quite managed to dull. The alertness of someone who'd been managing a great deal for a long time and couldn't afford to stop paying attention. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the bread. "Is that sourdough?" she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Real sourdough? With a proper starter?" 4 years old, Evelyn said. She'd brought the starter with her from the rented room, one of 3 things she'd decided were non-negotiable when she'd packed. "I've been feeding it since before my husband died." The woman looked at her. "You're a widow," she said. 2 years. Something shifted in the woman's face. Not pity, which Evelyn was tired of, but recognition. The particular recognition of someone who knew what the sentence "my husband died" actually weighed. "So am I," she said. "A year and a half." Evelyn put a slice of bread in front of her and sat down across the table, and they talked for 20 minutes. 2 women in a kitchen on the Montana frontier talking about nothing particularly remarkable. The road north, the price of flour, whether the winter was going to be as hard as people were predicting. And somehow in the shape of that ordinary conversation was something that neither of them had had enough of lately, which was simply being understood without having to explain. When the family left an hour later, the woman pressed 2 coins into Evelyn's hand at the door, more than the food was worth, not by much. "For the bread," she said. But they both knew it was for something else, too. That night, Nathan found Evelyn at the kitchen table after supper, writing in the small notebook she used for recipes and supply lists. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. "The Whitmore family," he said. "Word will get out that there's food here worth stopping for." "I know," Evelyn said. "It'll mean more work for you." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "I want to compensate you for it. Not the same wage. More." She looked up from the notebook. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to. The ranch gets the benefit. It should pay for it." She studied him. He was serious the way he was always serious. Not heavy, not portentous, just meaning what he said without decoration. It was a quality she'd stopped taking for granted, this directness of his, because she'd spent enough time around men who said things they didn't mean and meant things they didn't say to understand how rare its absence of ambiguity was. "Then we'll negotiate properly," she said. "I'll give you a number tomorrow." "Fair enough," he said. She went back to the notebook. He finished his coffee without hurrying. Neither of them said anything else. And it wasn't uncomfortable, the silence. It was the kind of silence that existed between people who'd established enough understanding that they didn't need to fill every gap in it. She noticed later that she'd stayed at the table writing for another 20 minutes after he left, and she'd been comfortable, and she hadn't thought about the rented room once. In the 5th week, Victor Harlan's story changed shape. Calhoun brought her the update the same way he'd brought the first one, directly, without preamble. He'd been to town for supplies with 2 of the other hands, and he'd heard from Tipton at the general store, who apparently felt guilty enough about his earlier role as a conduit to now be passing information back the other way. "Harlan's not just asking questions anymore," Calhoun said. "He's filed a formal complaint with the county board. Claims the ranch is operating an unlicensed commercial food establishment." Evelyn put down the knife she was using. "He's claiming I'm running a business. He's claiming Nathan is through you, that the travelers who stop aren't charity stops, that there's a commercial operation here that doesn't have the proper county licensing." She thought about the 2 coins the woman had pressed into her hand. She thought about the small amounts that other travelers had quietly left. She hadn't thought of it as commerce. She'd thought of it as the way things worked out here, an exchange of hospitality for something, not charity and not quite a transaction. "Is there a legal basis for it?" she said. "I don't know the law that finely," Calhoun said. "But Harlan knows a man on the county board, and that man knows 2 others, and the law on isolated ranch operations is—" He stopped. "Unclear enough to argue about." That was what Victor did. He found the unclear places and put his weight in them. Nathan knows, she said. I told him before I told you, Calhoun said. He's angry. A pause. Not at you. I want to be specific about that. I know, she said. He's going to fight it. He'll spend money on lawyers that he shouldn't have to spend, Evelyn said. He said the same thing about you 18 months ago, Calhoun said quietly, that you shouldn't have had to lose your bakery, that Harlan shouldn't have gotten away with it. She looked at him. You've known about what Harlan did to the bakery longer than just the last few weeks, she said. Calhoun met her eyes. The territory's not as big as people think, he said, and Harlan's the kind of man people talk about, the things he's done. He picked up his coffee. Nathan looked into it before he made you the offer, not to investigate you, to understand what you'd survived. She absorbed this for a moment. The idea that Nathan had known the whole story before he'd bought the bread at the market, before he'd made the offer, before any of it, that he'd come to that market table not just because the bread was good, but because he already understood what it had cost her to be standing there. She didn't know what to do with that. I'm going to need to know exactly what the county ordinance says, she said. All of it. The specific language. Can you get me a copy? Calhoun raised an eyebrow. What are you planning? I'm not planning anything yet, she said. I'm planning to understand the situation before I plan anything. That's different. She picked up the knife again. There's supper to make. Can you get me the ordinance? I can, he said. Thank you, Calhoun. He nodded. He walked out. She heard the screen door settle close behind him, and then she was alone in the kitchen with the cold coming under the door and the stove going warm, and the problem sitting in front of her like a pot that had been left too long and needed her full attention. She began to cut, and she began to think. Nathan came to the kitchen that evening after supper, later than usual when the house had gone quiet. He brought 2 cups of coffee, poured them himself from the pot on the stove and set one in front of her without asking, and sat down across the table. She'd been reviewing the notes she'd made from the county ordinance text Calhoun had brought back. Her notebook was open. She didn't put it away when Nathan sat down. Calhoun told you I know the full history, he said. He did, she said. I should have told you myself, Nathan said. He said it the way he said things he meant, directly, no softening. I didn't because I didn't want it to change the terms of the offer. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something for knowing, or like I'd offered you the position out of... He stopped. Pity, she said. Yes. She looked at him. Did you? No, he said, and it was immediate and unambiguous. I offered it because you made the best bread I'd eaten in 20 years, and because you were still standing there making it when most people would have gone home. That was enough. The rest was just context. She looked at her notes for a moment. He's going to try to make this about me specifically, she said. Not the ranch, me. He'll argue that I'm operating independently, that the transactions happen at my initiative, that the ranch is incidental, that keeps it from being about you in a way that might generate sympathy for you, and makes it about a woman overstepping her legal standing. Nathan was quiet. That's a careful read of how he operates, he said. I've had 18 months to think about how he operates, she said. He didn't destroy my bakery in one move. He did it in small moves, each one deniable, until the damage was done. He doesn't commit to a fight he might lose. He commits to a slow erosion. She watched Nathan's hands around the coffee cup. Working hands, knuckled and scarred in the specific ways of a man who'd spent decades doing physical things. They were still on the cup. I'm going to get a lawyer, he said. I know. I want to see who he recommends first. She looked up. Not because I don't trust your judgment, because I want to understand who's in this room before the room fills up. He looked at her steadily. You're thinking 3 steps ahead. I'm thinking about not losing twice, she said. There's a difference. Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not the kind of shift you'd notice if you weren't paying attention. But she was paying attention. It was the expression of a man recalibrating something he'd already thought he understood. What do you need from me? He said. Time, she said. And the kitchen. You have both, he said. She nodded. She looked at her notes. He finished his coffee. Evelyn, he said. She looked up. He's not going to win this one, Nathan said. Not a promise, exactly. Not bravado. Just a statement of something he'd apparently decided. I want you to know I believe that. She looked at him for a moment. This spare, steady man who'd stopped at her table when no one else had, who'd known her history before he offered her the position, who came to the kitchen doorway and waited rather than walking in, who poured his coffee himself and didn't make speeches about it. "I believe it too," she said, "but believing isn't enough. We have to build it." He stood up. He took both cups to the basin. He set them down carefully. "Then we'll start building," he said. The building started with the other women. Evelyn hadn't planned for it. It happened the way many important things happened on the frontier, because necessity created a path, and people walked it. The woman from the Whitmore family who'd passed through had mentioned Evelyn to someone she knew, who mentioned it to someone else. And within 2 weeks of November, there was a small, irregular current of women passing through the ranch, or sending word ahead. Not travelers exactly, not customers, but women who'd heard about the widow who ran the kitchen at Coal Ridge, and who needed something they couldn't quite name but recognized when they found it. A young woman named Clara arrived one afternoon from a homestead 12 miles east. Her husband had broken his leg in September and hadn't healed right, and she'd been running the homestead alone since then with 2 children under 5 and a third due in spring. She came in, sat down at the kitchen table and said, "I heard you might know how to stretch provisions." "I might," Evelyn said. They sat for 2 hours and Evelyn talked her through everything. What kept longest, what substituted for what, how to manage a cold cellar through a Montana winter, how to make something out of cornmeal that didn't constitute moral injury. Clara wrote things down in a small book she'd brought, writing fast, cramming words into margins. Before she left, she looked at Evelyn and said, "I didn't know women like you existed out here." "Women like what?" Evelyn said. "Women who know things," Clara said. "Who'll tell you?" She hesitated. "Most people out here are trying to get through alone, like there's some shame in needing to learn something from someone else." Evelyn thought about the bakery. She thought about the rented room. She thought about standing at the market table in the cold, cutting bread slices that nobody wanted, telling herself just one more hour. "There's no shame in it," she said. "There's only shame in not passing it on." Clara left, and Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the wagon go. And she thought about what it meant that a woman 12 miles out had made a round trip in November to talk about provisions, and what that said about how isolated the isolation actually was. She talked to Nathan that night. "I want to do something more formal," she said. "Not a business, not yet, but days. Specific days when women from the area can come and I can teach. What I know about running a kitchen in hard conditions. What I know about managing food through a winter. What I know about staying." Nathan had been looking at the fire. He looked at her. "Staying," he repeated. "Surviving isn't the right word," she said. "Surviving is what you do when you're in the worst of it. Staying is what you do after, building a reason to, building a life that has form to it, not just duration." He was quiet for a moment. "How many women are we talking about?" "I don't know yet. It would depend on word spreading, and on who has transportation, and on..." She stopped. "You're asking if you can support it." "I'm asking what it would need," he said. "Space," she said. "The kitchen on teaching days, and probably..." She thought. "A letter to the county, formal, documenting what the teaching is and isn't, so Harlan can't get there first with his version of what it is." Nathan looked at her. "You're building a defense while building the thing itself." "I'm not thinking about Harlan," she said. "I'm thinking about Clara." He was quiet a long moment. Outside the wind was picking up, the particular high whine it made when serious cold was coming. "You have the kitchen," he said, "whatever days you need it." She thought, this is what it feels like, not rescue, not charity, just someone standing beside you and saying yes to the right questions. She didn't say that out loud. She said, "Thank you, Nathan." He nodded once and went back to the fire, and she went back to thinking about Clara and about the women who might come after Clara, and about what could grow from something as simple as a kitchen where people were told the truth about things. The first teaching morning was a Tuesday in late November, 2 weeks after Evelyn had raised the idea. 6 women came. She hadn't known how many to expect. Could have been 2, could have been 12. 6 felt both larger and smaller than she'd anticipated. They arrived in different ways, at different times, from different distances. Clara came back and brought a neighbor. A woman named Ida Marsh, who ran a boarding house in the small settlement of Keswick, 7 miles west, came alone and introduced herself with a handshake that was firmer than most men's. A mother and her teenage daughter arrived together, the girl with the careful attentiveness of someone who understood she was being given access to something valuable and intended to use it. And a woman Evelyn recognized from the market, one of the ones who'd walked past her table in October, came and stood at the edge of the kitchen doorway for a moment before she came in. And when she did, she said, I'm sorry I didn't stop. And Evelyn said, "You stopped now." And that was all either of them said about it. They were in the kitchen for 4 hours. Evelyn talked about flour, the different types, what each one actually did in a recipe, why cheap flour was false economy when you were making anything that needed to rise. She talked about fire management, about how to read a wood stove, about the difference between the heat you wanted for bread and the heat you wanted for meat. She talked about the cold cellar, about preservation, about the particular hierarchy of what to use first and what would hold. But mostly she talked about judgment, about how cooking in hard conditions was not about following instructions. Instructions assumed you had everything the instruction required, which you never did, not out here, but about understanding the principles well enough to improvise, about how to look at what you had and see what it could become rather than what it wasn't. Ida Marsh, who had been listening with her arms folded and her expression measuring, said at one point, "This is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Evelyn said. "Recipes," Ida said. "I have recipes. They don't help when you're out of half the ingredients." "Recipes are someone else's judgment written down," Evelyn said. "Your own judgment is better. You just have to build it." Ida unfolded her arms. She picked up a pencil. She started writing. The room was warm and it smelled like bread. Evelyn had started a batch early that morning, so there would be something in the oven during the teaching, not as demonstration, but because the smell of bread working was its own kind of argument for why any of this mattered. The women filled the kitchen in a way it hadn't been filled since she'd arrived, not with quantity, but with a quality of attention that changed the space. Nathan came in once, mid-morning, for the coffee he usually got at that hour. He stopped when he saw the full kitchen, looked at the group of women around the table, and then caught Evelyn's eye across the room. She couldn't read exactly what was in his expression, something quieter than surprise, something more considered. He poured his coffee and left without saying anything, which was exactly right. When the women left that afternoon, Clara was the last one out. She stopped at the door and looked back at Evelyn. "Same Tuesday next month?" she said. "Same Tuesday next month," Evelyn said. After Clara's wagon had cleared the yard, Evelyn sat down at the kitchen table, just sat down, which she rarely did during the day. And she was aware of the particular quality of the silence after a room full of people had been in it, the way the space held a residue of presence even after everyone was gone. She thought about Victor Harland in the county board office. She thought about his careful, deniable moves and his slow erosion and his voice at the market saying, "Fat widow," to the October air. She thought, you can work very hard to remove one person from a community, but you cannot remove the idea of what that person made possible once it has already existed. She got up. There was supper to start. Tommy Briggs would be in at 5:30 wanting coffee and not asking for it. Parker would need to be told the cold was going to be serious tonight, and the horses would want extra hay. Calhoun would come in for his mid-afternoon cup and say nothing meaningful and mean something specific by it. She had work to do. She got back to it. The county hearing was set for the second Thursday of December. Nathan got the official notice on a Monday morning, hand-delivered by a rider from Black Hollow, who left it at the gate and didn't wait for a response. The document was 2 pages, formal language in the particular dry style of county administration, which managed to say a great deal while meaning very little that was specific. The complaint cited unauthorized commercial food operations on private ranch land, potential violations of the Territorial Commerce Ordinance of 1882, and requested that one Evelyn Carter appear before the Black Hollow County Board to answer questions regarding the nature and scope of her activities at Coal Ridge Ranch. Her name. Not Nathan's. Hers. She'd predicted that, and being right about it didn't make it easier to read. Nathan brought the notice to the kitchen and set it on the table in front of her without comment. She read it twice, put it down, and went back to the bread she was shaping. He watched her do this. "You're not going to say anything?" he said. "I'm going to say quite a lot," she said. "Just not yet." Not until I've thought it through. She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. How much time do we have? 10 days. 10 days. She turned the dough, pressed again. Has the lawyer seen this? Reed will be here tomorrow morning. She'd met Daniel Reed twice, a compact, precise man from Billings, who Nathan had retained 2 weeks earlier when the complaint was first filed, before the hearing date was set. He had the quality she valued most in people who were supposed to help you. He listened to all of it before he said anything, and what he said after was always specifically about what you'd told him, rather than about what he'd already decided before you spoke. Good, she said. I want to be in that meeting. I assumed you would, Nathan said. Some men would have assumed the opposite, she said. He picked up the notice from the table and folded it back along its crease. I'm not some men, he said, without defensiveness, just as a statement of fact, and left. She shaped the last loaf and set it to rest, and she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard where the cold had settled in permanently now, the ground iron hard, the sky the particular flat white of serious Montana winter. She thought about the county board, 5 men. She knew 2 of their names from what Calhoun had found out, and one of those names was connected to Victor Harland in the way that money connected people in small territories. She thought about the complaint's careful language and what it left open and what it closed off. She thought about the bakery, the way it had ended, not with a confrontation, not with a chance to speak, just with the slow withdrawal of business until there was nothing left to withdraw from. She'd had no forum then, no table at which to sit and be heard. Victor had worked entirely in the margins, in whisper and implication, and she'd had nothing to answer it with. She had something now. She went to get her notebook. Reed arrived the next morning before 8, which told her he was taking this seriously enough to travel in the dark. He sat at the kitchen table with Nathan and Calhoun. Evelyn had asked Calhoun to be present, and Nathan had agreed without requiring an explanation. And he spread the documents across the table and went through them in order. The complaint, as written, had a specific structure that Reed identified quickly. Harlan knows he can't win on the commercial operation argument if it goes to a full legal examination, he said. The county ordinance covers established food service businesses with fixed premises. What's happening here doesn't meet the definition. He knows that. Then what is he actually doing? Nathan said. He's creating a public record, Reed said. The hearing isn't about whether he wins the legal argument. It's about generating enough official-sounding documentation of questions about Mrs. Carter's activities that her reputation takes damage regardless of the outcome. He looked at Evelyn directly. He did something similar to your bakery, I understand. Different mechanism, same principle. He worked through rumors then, Evelyn said. He didn't file anything. He's escalated, Reed said, which tells me he's more alarmed this time. What you're doing here, the cooking, the teaching days, the women coming from other areas, that's a different kind of threat than a bakery. A bakery is a business he can undermine financially. What you're building here has a different value. Social, reputational, the kind that doesn't depend on commerce to continue. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Calhoun said, He's afraid of her. He's afraid of what she represents, Reed said, which is effectively the same thing. He turned to Evelyn. At the hearing, he'll push for you to be defensive. He'll frame questions in ways that make answering them seem like admission of something. He'll use the official setting to make you feel like you're already in the wrong position. I know his methods, Evelyn said. What I'd like to know, Reed said, is what you want to say. Not what we need to say legally. What you want to say. She looked at him. It was an unusual question from a lawyer, which was probably why she liked him. I want to say that I've spent 2 years being erased by this man, she said. Not directly. He doesn't do anything directly. He works through what other people think of you, through the gap between what's true and what's allowed to become the story. She looked at the papers on the table. I want to say that I was not wrong to lose my bakery and survive it. I was not wrong to keep baking. I was not wrong to accept work when it was offered. I was not wrong to teach other women what I know. None of it was wrong, and I'm done performing apology for any of it. The kitchen was quiet again. Reed wrote something in his notebook. Nathan was looking at the table. Calhoun's coffee cup was halfway to his mouth and had stopped there. All right, Reed said. Then here's how we build toward that. The 10 days before the hearing were the hardest she'd spent since the winter after James died. Not because of the legal preparation, though that was considerable. Not because of the cold, which by the second week of December had become the kind of cold that made the ranch feel very far from everything, and not always in a comfortable way. It was hard because of the quality of the waiting, the particular pressure of knowing something was coming and not being able to move toward it faster than the calendar allowed. She cooked. She taught the December Tuesday session, which had grown to 9 women, 2 of them new. She filled the cold cellar records Reed had asked for, documenting the traveling visitors and what she'd provided and on what terms, building the clear factual record that showed the pattern of what she'd done and what it wasn't. She wrote out a full account of what had happened with the bakery 18 months ago, everything she remembered, in order, with whatever specifics she could still produce, because Reed said that history was relevant, and she agreed. Tommy Briggs found her at the supply table one afternoon, cross-checking an inventory list, and he stood there for a moment before he said, "Are you going to be all right?" She looked up. He was asking with genuine concern, but also with the slight awkwardness of a 21-year-old man who knew something mattered and wasn't sure how to say so. "I'm going to be fine," she said. Then, because he deserved more than the automatic answer, "I'm frightened. Not of losing. I've lost before and survived it. I'm frightened of the part where you have to stand up in front of people who've already decided what they think and tell them the truth anyway." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "That's the part my mother always said was the hardest thing," he said. "Not the deciding to be honest. The deciding to be honest when it might not change anything." She looked at him. "She was right," Evelyn said. "She usually was," Tommy said. He picked up the inventory list without being asked and started reading items off it, while she checked them against the shelf, and neither of them said anything else about it, which was its own kind of consideration. Harker came in 2 days before the hearing with a piece of information he'd gotten from a man he knew in Keswick. Victor Harlan had been visiting the county board members individually over the past week. Social calls, nothing official, just a man paying his respects to acquaintances. Harker reported this with the flat tone of someone conveying intelligence, not editorializing. Evelyn relayed it to Reed that evening. "Expected," Reed said, countered partly by the letters. The letters were something she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. Calhoun had apparently told the ranch hands about the hearing in his own spare way, and within a day she'd found a folded paper on the kitchen table, so no envelope, just folded, that turned out to be a written statement from Dwyer describing what the kitchen had meant to the working conditions of the ranch, written in the direct, unpunctuated style of a man who didn't write often but meant every word he put down. Then one from Harker. Then Tommy's, which was longer than she expected and specifically mentioned the apple pie and his mother, and which she read twice and then put in her coat pocket and kept there. Ida Marsh sent a formal letter on the boarding house stationery. Clara wrote 2 pages that included a specific accounting of what she'd learned on the Teaching Tuesday and how it had changed the winter management of her homestead. The woman from the market, whose name was Ruth Calloway, Evelyn had learned, and whose husband ran a small mill outside Black Hollow, wrote a single paragraph that was the most direct of all of them. She had been wrong to walk past that table in October, and she intended to say so to anyone who asked. 8 letters in total, by the night before the hearing. Reed laid them on the kitchen table and looked at them. "This is not nothing," he said. "No," Nathan said. He was standing at the edge of the kitchen, arms crossed, with the particular quality of stillness he had when he was calculating something. "It's what she built." Reed looked at him. "The board will try to characterize it as organized advocacy. Friends testifying for a friend." "Then we frame it correctly," Nathan said. "These are independent witnesses describing what they directly observed. That's different from advocacy." "Yes," Reed said. "That's exactly right." He looked at Evelyn. "You understand that Harlan will try to make you feel small in that room. The official setting, the formal procedure, all of it designed to make the person being questioned feel like they've already done something wrong." "I know," she said, "and you won't let him." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "I've spent 2 years being made to feel like my existence was an imposition," she said. "I'm done with that. Whatever he puts in that room, he's not going to get that from me again." The Black Hollow County Board met in the back room of the courthouse, which was a solid building near the center of town that smelled of old wood and cold air and the particular staleness of official spaces that were used infrequently and not well ventilated. There were 5 board members seated at the long table at the front of the room, Men of varying ages with the shared quality of people who held small authority carefully, aware that in a territory this size, small authority was often the only kind that existed and therefore mattered more than it might elsewhere. Victor Harland was already there when Evelyn arrived with Nathan and Reed. He was seated to the side, not at the board table. He wasn't a board member, just the complainant. With two men beside him she didn't recognize but who had the look of people brought to fill space and project confidence. He was dressed well, the fur collar coat, the good hat. He looked at her when she came in. She looked back. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to establish that she was not going to look away first, and then she looked at the board table and found her seat. The proceeding opened with the board chairman, a man named Geller, reading the formal complaint. She listened to it carefully, hearing in the careful bureaucratic language the specific shape of Victor's strategy. The words commercial operation repeated, the phrase potential violations, the particular emphasis on activities conducted by one Evelyn Carter that placed everything squarely on her and nothing adjacent to Nathan or the ranch itself. Reed had predicted this. She made a small note on the paper in front of her. Victor's presentation came first. He stood and spoke with the comfortable authority of a man who was used to rooms like this one, used to the formality and the precedent and the particular leverage of official language, and he laid out his case in measured terms. He was not angry, not theatrical. He cited the Commerce Ordinance. He mentioned the travelers who had stopped and the transactions that had taken place. He used the word unlicensed 5 times. He was careful never to say anything that could be directly disproven. He cited implications, possibilities, the language of concern rather than accusation. It is difficult to know, he said at one point, whether these activities represent an isolated case or a pattern of commercial operation that has been deliberately obscured. Deliberately obscured. She wrote those 2 words down. When Reed presented the response, he was methodical. He walked through the ordinance definition point by point, what a commercial food establishment legally required, what Coal Ridge Ranch's kitchen operations did and did not meet in terms of those requirements. He introduced the letters. He presented the cold cellar documentation. He was precise and clear, and he never raised his voice. The board members listened. Geller asked questions that were genuinely questions, not rhetorical traps. He was trying to understand the situation, which was the best she could have hoped for from the chair. 2 of the other board members seemed to have arrived with a position already formed, asking questions in the leaning way of people who want confirmation rather than information. The 5th man said almost nothing, which she couldn't read yet. Victor was allowed a response to Reed's presentation. He stood again and shifted slightly. The first shift she'd seen in him, the first suggestion that the letters and the documentation had landed somewhere he hadn't fully anticipated. And he said, "The question is not merely whether the technical definition of a commercial establishment is met. The question is about the character of the operation and the character of the person running it. And the board should be aware that Mrs. Carter has a history of operating without proper oversight, which is precisely why her previous business venture in Black Hollow failed." The room was quiet. Evelyn's pen was still on the paper. Her previous business venture in Black Hollow failed. Not, her business was destroyed by targeted slander. Not, she was forced out by rumor that no one ever formally challenged. Her venture failed. The passive construction, removing any agent from the sentence, making it simply something that happened, a fact of nature like a freeze or a flood. She understood in that moment that she'd spent 18 months accepting that sentence. Not saying it herself, not believing it, but absorbing it as the official story of what had occurred. Because there had been no other story available, no forum, no record. Just the bakery closing and the room above the feed store and the market table in October where nobody stopped. Reed looked at her. She gave him a small nod. "Mrs. Carter," Geller said, "do you wish to address the board directly?" She stood. She had prepared notes. She left them on the table. She looked at the board, at Geller first, because he was the one actually listening, then at the 2 who'd arrived with their positions, who she wasn't going to reach and knew it, then at the 5th man who'd said nothing, who looked at her with a quality of attention she couldn't read. "I want to address what Mr. Harland said a moment ago," she said, "that my previous business venture failed." She kept her voice level. Not loud, not tight, level. 18 months ago, I operated a bakery in Black Hollow. That bakery served this community every morning for 3 years. It didn't fail. It was systematically undermined by rumors spread through this community about the quality of my products and my competence as an operator. Those rumors were false. They were specific enough to sound informed and vague enough to be impossible to directly disprove, and they originated from a source with a financial interest in removing a competitor who was succeeding. Victor made a sound, not words, just the beginning of an objection. Geller held up one hand. Let her finish. She kept her eyes on the board. I cannot prove in this room that Victor Harland is the source of those rumors. I couldn't prove it 18 months ago either, which is why I said nothing and accepted the loss. I am not here today to make that accusation formally. I am here because I was summoned, and because having been summoned, I will tell the truth about what I have done and why. The room was very still. I cook for the men of Coal Ridge Ranch because I was hired to cook for them. That is the extent of the commercial arrangement. When travelers have stopped at the ranch, I have given them food because it is the right thing to do when someone is cold and far from the next settlement. Some of them have left small amounts voluntarily. I have not refused it because refusing it would be discourteous and because it has not constituted a business. On Tuesday mornings in November and December, I have taught other women in this territory what I know about managing a kitchen in hard conditions, because the women out here are doing the hardest work in this territory with the least support, and what I know is not private knowledge. It belongs to anyone willing to learn it. She paused. She was aware of the room around her, the cold air, the creak of wood, the specific quality of attention that came from people deciding something. Mr. Harlan told this board that the question is about my character, she said. I agree with that. My character is this. I lost a business I built. I survived it. I kept working. I took honest employment when it was offered. I taught what I know to women who needed it. I did not hide any of it. I did not misrepresent any of it, and I am not going to apologize for any of it. She looked directly at Victor for the first time since she'd begun speaking. I was not weak 18 months ago. I had no place to stand. I have one now, and I intend to use it. She sat down. The silence in the room lasted long enough to be its own kind of statement. Victor stood. He was controlled, but there was something different in his posture, a containment that hadn't been necessary before. The personal history Mrs. Carter describes is precisely the kind of emotionally motivated narrative that, Mr. Harland, Geller said, you've made your presentation. Victor stopped. The fifth board member, the quiet one, cleared his throat. I'd like to ask Mr. Harland a question, he said. His name was Orrin Pruitt, Evelyn would learn later, a farmer from the north end of the county who'd been on the board 3 years and was generally considered the most independent of the 5. The travelers who stopped at Coal Ridge Ranch, were any of them harmed by what they received? Victor paused. That isn't the... Were they harmed? Pruitt said. No. The women who attended the teaching sessions, were they harmed? The question is one of legal compliance, not... I'm asking a factual question, Pruitt said, with a patience that was its own form of precision. Were any of the women harmed by attending? No, Victor said. Was anyone in this county harmed by anything Mrs. Carter did at Coal Ridge Ranch? A pause. No, Victor said. Then what specifically is the injury this board is being asked to remedy? The room was quiet. Victor spoke for another 2 minutes, carefully, working to recover the ground he'd lost. He was skilled at this. Recovery, reframing, finding the edge of a new argument when the previous one had been cornered. But something had shifted in the room's attention. Pruitt had asked the question that Reed had been building toward, but hadn't needed to ask directly because Pruitt had asked it himself. And the question, unanswerable in the way Victor needed to answer it, sat in the air of the room like an open window letting cold in. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. They did it in an adjacent room, which left Evelyn and Nathan and Reed sitting in the hearing room with Victor's 2 associates on the other side of the space. Nobody spoke. Victor had gone out to the corridor. Reed reviewed his notes. Nathan sat with his arms on the table and his hands still. You did well, Reed said quietly to Evelyn. I said what was true, she said. Yes, that's what I mean. Nathan looked at her. She couldn't read his expression, not fully. It was the kind of expression that had too much in it to simplify into a single word. He said nothing, which was sometimes the thing that meant the most from him. The board came back. Geller read the finding. The complaint was dismissed. The operation at Coal Ridge Ranch did not constitute an unlicensed commercial food establishment under the applicable territorial ordinance. The teaching activities were specifically noted as falling outside any commercial definition and were further described, in language that seemed to be Pruitt's, as consistent with the established frontier tradition of community knowledge exchange. Geller looked at Victor when he read that last part. Victor looked at the table. Reed began gathering his documents. Nathan stood. Evelyn stayed seated for one more moment, hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular. She was thinking about the bakery, about the morning she'd handed the key back to the landlord and walked out into the summer heat with nothing decided yet about what came next. About 18 months of small rooms and borrowed wagons and market tables where nobody stopped. She was thinking, it doesn't undo any of that. The hearing finding doesn't give back what was taken. That's not how things worked. Not out here, not anywhere. What was lost stayed lost. You built from what remained. But she'd stood in the room. She'd said the true thing in the room where it needed to be said. And whatever Victor Harlan told about her now, there was a record, an actual record, on county paper, in an actual courthouse, that said she had stood there and told the truth, and the truth had held. She stood up. Nathan was beside her when she stood. Not hovering, not making a gesture of it, just present in the particular way he was present, the way she'd come to understand as specifically his. They walked out of the courthouse together into the December cold, and the sky above Black Hollow was the flat white of deep winter. And the street was mostly empty at that hour. And she stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the courthouse and breathed the cold air in and let it out, and didn't say anything for a moment. Ruth Calloway was right, she finally said. Nathan looked at her. About what? She said she intended to tell anyone who asked that she'd been wrong to walk past my table. Evelyn looked at the street. That's what I didn't have before. People willing to say the true thing in the right place. She turned and looked at him. You built that. The letters. The men's statements. Read. All of it. You built it, Nathan said. I provided the address. She looked at him for a moment. This man who'd stopped at her table and bought everything she had and offered her a kitchen and stood beside her in a county hearing and never once, in all of it, made her feel like she was receiving charity rather than occupying the space she'd earned. Thank you, she said, for all of it. He nodded once. He looked at the street, then back at her. Ready to go home? He said. She registered the word. Home. She didn't correct him. She didn't examine it. She just said yes, and they walked to where the wagon was hitched, and she climbed up, and they drove north out of Black Hollow on the iron-hard road toward the ranch, while the winter sky held its cold, flat light over everything, and she thought about supper, and about Tommy's coffee cup, and about the women who would come on the next Tuesday morning, and about the particular sound the kitchen made in the early hours when she was the only one awake in it, and the stove was going, and the bread was resting, and everything that needed to exist was already exactly where it needed to be. The word spread faster than she expected, and in directions she hadn't anticipated. She'd understood that the hearing would generate talk. In a territory this size, any county board proceeding became common knowledge within a week, and a proceeding that ended the way this one had, with a complaint dismissed and the particulars of Victor Harlan's methods now part of an official record, was the kind of talk that traveled with specific velocity. What she hadn't anticipated was the shape of it. She'd expected the story to be about the legal outcome, about the ordinance and Reed's arguments and the board's finding. Instead, the story that moved through Black Hollow and the settlements around it was about what she'd said in the room. Orrin Pruitt told someone. That someone told two others. By the time January arrived and the new year settled over the territory, with its particular quality of cold that felt like a permanent condition rather than a season, the words she'd used in that courthouse had been repeated often enough that they'd taken on the slightly altered quality of things that passed through many mouths, compressed, clarified, sharpened by retelling into something more precise than what she'd actually said, which was how important things sometimes became more true in the retelling than they'd been in the original moment. What people quoted back to her, over the weeks that followed, was this. I was not weak. I had no place to stand. I have one now. She hadn't said it quite that way, but that was what it had meant, and she didn't correct anyone. The first sign that something had changed came from Ruth Calloway. Ruth arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning in early January. Not a Tuesday, not a teaching day, driving her own wagon alone, which was a considerable effort from the mill outside Black Hollow in January. Evelyn saw her coming from the kitchen window and went to the door. "I'm not here for a lesson," Ruth said before Evelyn could speak. "I'm here because I want to ask you something." "Come in," Evelyn said. Ruth sat at the kitchen table and folded her hands on it with the posture of a woman who'd decided to say something and was going to say it without flinching. She was in her mid-40s, plain-spoken, with the kind of face that had stopped trying to be anything other than what it was, and was better for it. "My sister-in-law is in a situation," Ruth said. "Her husband died in November. She has a homestead east of Keswick, 40 acres, 2 children. She's trying to decide whether to go back to her family in Illinois or stay and fight for the land." She looked at Evelyn directly. "I told her she should talk to you." "I'm not a lawyer," Evelyn said. "I know that. She doesn't need a lawyer yet. She needs to talk to someone who's been where she is and didn't run." Ruth paused. "I walked past your table in October because I'd heard things about you, things people were saying. I believed them because they were being said by people I thought I had reason to trust, and it was easier to believe them than to look for myself." Her hands tightened slightly on the table. "I'd like to fix the part of that I can still fix." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Ruth was not performing apology. There was nothing theatrical about her, nothing that required anything from Evelyn in return for the admission. She was just a woman sitting at a table being honest about something she'd done wrong. "Send her to me," Evelyn said. "Whenever she's ready." Ruth nodded. She accepted coffee and stayed 20 minutes, talking about the mill and the winter and ordinary things. And when she left, she shook Evelyn's hand at the door with the same firm grip she'd used the first time. Evelyn went back to the kitchen and stood there for a moment, aware that something had shifted, aware that it would require thought to understand its full shape. And then she put the coffee pot back on the stove because there was work to do, and the thought could wait until the work was done. Ruth's sister-in-law came the following week. Her name was Margaret Sorrell, dark-haired, thin in the specific way of someone who'd been eating less than they needed for a while and had stopped noticing. And she came with her 2 children, a boy of about 8 and a girl slightly younger, who sat in the corner of the kitchen and were very quiet with the alertness of children who'd learned that being quiet made things easier for the adult they depended on. Evelyn gave the children bread with butter and set them up with the small task she kept for moments like this: shelling dried beans into a bowl, something that occupied hands and attention without requiring instruction or supervision. They settled into it immediately, which told her they were accustomed to being useful, which told her something about how the homestead had been running. Margaret watched this happen, and then looked at Evelyn with an expression that contained too many things at once to name easily. "Ruth said you lost your bakery," Margaret said, "and then you started over." "That's roughly accurate," Evelyn said. She sat down across from her. "What are you trying to decide?" "Whether to go home." Margaret's hands were on the table, chapped and capable looking. "My family in Illinois, my mother and my brother, they're telling me to come back, that the land isn't worth what it's costing me, that a woman alone with 2 children can't hold 40 acres in Montana." She looked at the table. "The thing is, I don't know if they're wrong." "What does the land have on it?" Evelyn said. Margaret blinked. "What?" "What's actually on the land? What did your husband build before he died?" "A house, small but solid, a well that actually reaches water, which is rarer than people tell you before you come out here. A barn that needs the east wall repaired, about 12 acres under cultivation, rest is grazing." She stopped. "He spent 3 years on that well." "A good well is worth more than 12 people will tell you," Evelyn said. "I know that." Margaret's voice had an edge in it now. Not at Evelyn, but at the situation, which was the healthy kind of edge, the kind that meant she wasn't defeated, just tired and frightened. "I know it. But knowing it and being able to hold on to it are different things." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She watched the children with their beans. The boy had developed a small system for sorting, pulling out any that were discolored and setting them aside in a separate pile, which nobody had asked him to do. He'd invented it himself because it was the more rigorous method, which told her something about how he thought. "What would you need," Evelyn said, "to make staying feel possible instead of just stubborn?" Margaret looked at her. The question seemed to reach her in a way that the other conversations she'd been having hadn't, because she was quiet for a moment before she answered, and when she answered, it was without the defensive efficiency of someone who'd been repeating prepared points. "I'd need to know I wasn't trying to do it completely alone," she said. "My husband had a neighbor who helped him with the fence line last spring. Since November, that man's barely looked at me when we pass in town. Like without Frank, I'm a different category of person." She stopped. "I need to know there are people who understand what I'm doing and why it matters. Not to help me do it, just to know it matters." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. "It matters," she said. It was not a complicated thing to say. It was the most direct thing available, and so she said it. Margaret looked at her, and her eyes went wet, and she blinked twice and pressed her lips together and did not cry, which took visible effort, and Evelyn didn't comment on it, just got up and checked the bread in the oven and gave Margaret the 30 seconds she needed to put herself back together. "Come on Tuesdays," Evelyn said when she came back to the table. "Bring the children. We'll find something for them to do." Margaret came on Tuesdays, and she brought her neighbor from 3 miles further out, a widow named Delia Park, whose situation was different in its particulars and identical in its essentials. And Delia brought a young woman, barely 19, married less than a year, husband unreliable in ways she described with careful understatement, who came once and then came back and then started arriving early. The kitchen on Tuesday mornings filled up. 12 women in January, 14 in February, when the cold should have been keeping people home but didn't, because the cold was exactly the reason to come. They crowded around the table and the counter and stood when there were no chairs left and nobody complained about it. Evelyn taught them what she knew, but she was learning something too, learning the specific shape of what was needed, what gaps existed between what these women had been taught and what life in this territory actually required. She began organizing it differently, not as a lesson, but as a working session, where the teaching happened alongside the actual work of preparing food so that the learning was attached to real stakes rather than demonstration. Ida Marsh came every Tuesday and sat in the same spot and wrote everything down with a thoroughness that Evelyn found both useful and slightly startling. "You should be writing this yourself," Ida told her one morning, tapping her notebook. "Properly, so it doesn't disappear when you're not in the room." "I'm always in the room," Evelyn said. "You won't always be," Ida said. "Write it down." Evelyn thought about that for several days before she started the notebook. Not a recipe book. She had 3 of those already. This was different. A record of the practical knowledge she'd assembled over 20 years of feeding people in difficult conditions, written in the plain language of someone who expected the reader to be tired and short on time and working with less than they needed. She wrote it in the evenings after supper, at the kitchen table, while the ranch settled around her into its nighttime sounds. Nathan found her writing one evening in late January and asked what she was working on. She showed him. He read several pages standing up, which meant he was actually reading it, not skimming. He handed it back. "That's the most useful thing I've read since the land survey," he said. "High praise," she said. "I mean it as such," he said. He poured his coffee and sat down, not across from her in the visitor position he usually took, but at the adjacent corner of the table, which was a small shift in arrangement that she noticed and said nothing about. "The Tuesday group is growing. 14 last week. Where are they putting the horses?" She looked at him. She hadn't thought about the horses. "I'll figure something out," she said. "I'll extend the tie-up on the south side of the barn," he said. "Enough for 20 animals." He said it the way he said most things he'd decided, already decided, not asking for approval. "It's not a large project." She looked at him steadily. "Nathan." "It's not an argument," he said. "It's a fence extension, 2 days' work." "I know it's not an argument. I'm trying to—" She stopped. She picked up her pen. "Thank you." "You keep thanking me," he said. "You keep doing things worth thanking," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. "I'm not doing it for gratitude," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm doing it because what's happening on Tuesday mornings it's changing this county. In a real way, not a newspaper story way, a real way." He looked at her. "A woman came to the gate last week asking for you specifically. She'd come from 40 miles out." "Which woman?" "Said her name was Patton. She'd heard about what happened at the county board. Said she had a situation with a landowner trying to pressure her off a claim, and she'd heard there was a woman at Coal Ridge who—" He stopped. He shook his head slightly. "She said she'd heard there was a woman here who'd stood up to Victor Harland and won." Evelyn was quiet. I didn't win anything, she said. I told the truth, and the board believed it. That's what winning is, Nathan said. She thought about that. She thought about Margaret Sorrell's 40 acres, and the well that took 3 years to dig, and her son inventing a sorting system for beans nobody had asked him to create. She thought about all the women who came on Tuesday with their notebooks and their tired hands and their specific, real, unromantic problems. And she thought about what it meant that they came at all, not because she had easy answers, but because she had a kitchen with a working stove and enough flour and the willingness to say what she actually knew. What did you tell the patent woman? She said. I told her to come back Tuesday, Nathan said. She nodded. She went back to the notebook. February brought a thaw that lasted 4 days and then reversed, which was the particular cruelty of Montana winter, and with the thaw came a visitor Evelyn hadn't expected, Orrin Pruitt. He drove up to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon after the morning session had ended and the women had gone and the kitchen was back to its daily self. He was a tall, lean man in his 60s with a deliberate way of moving that suggested he'd learned not to hurry because hurrying rarely improved outcomes, and he carried a hat he didn't wear inside. Mrs. Carter, he said. He sat at the kitchen table with a quality of stillness that reminded her of Calhoun. I have a question for you. You can say no. Ask it, she said. There's a woman in Keswick whose husband left her last fall. Just left. No divorce filed, no word, just gone. She has no legal recourse until he's been absent 2 years under territorial law, which means she can't remarry, can't legally manage certain property transactions, can't take on certain contracts. She's been trying to run a small merchandise operation, and she keeps hitting these walls. He turned his hat in his hands. I've been looking at what options exist for her, and they're limited. What I'm wondering is whether the network you've built here, the women who come on Tuesdays, whether that's the kind of thing that could provide some practical support while the legal situation works itself out. Evelyn looked at him. You're describing something more organized than what we're doing. I'm describing what you're already doing, Pruitt said. I'm just asking if you'd be willing to name it. She thought about Ida Marsh telling her to write things down so they didn't disappear when she wasn't in the room. She thought about the notebook she'd been filling since January. She thought about the tie-up Nathan was extending on the south side of the barn for 20 animals. What would naming it accomplish? She said. It would let people find it more easily, Pruitt said. It would let me refer people to something specific rather than saying, go talk to the woman at Coal Ridge. It would give it a form that persists. He looked at her steadily. The county has a process for formally registering community organizations. It doesn't require much. A name, a stated purpose, 2 officers. I'm not an officer of anything, Evelyn said. You are, Pruitt said. You just haven't named it yet. She sat with that for a moment. I'll need to talk to Nathan, she said. I expected that, Pruitt said. He stood and picked up his hat. Take your time. I'm not in a hurry. One more thing, Evelyn said. He stopped. At the hearing, she said. The questions you asked Harland, nobody asked you to ask those. No, he said. Why did you? Pruitt looked at his hat for a moment, then at her. I've been on that board 3 years, he said. I've sat through a lot of proceedings. Most of them are about what they say they're about. He paused. That one wasn't. And I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between a man presenting a legal argument and a man using a legal process to finish something he started by other means. He settled the hat on his head. Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter. He walked out. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left, looking at the table, at the empty chairs, at the kitchen that had started as a space she'd been given and had become something she'd built into a different thing entirely without quite planning to. She talked to Nathan that evening. He listened to the full account of the conversation with Pruitt without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? He said. I want to name it, she said. What it is. Formally. She looked at the table. I keep waiting to feel like I have enough to justify it. Enough authority, enough credentials. And then I think about the patent woman who came 40 miles, and Margaret, and the woman in Keswick with the absent husband and the merchandise operation and no legal recourse. She looked up. I don't know if I have enough credentials, but I know I have a kitchen, and I know what I know. That has to be sufficient. Nathan looked at her with that steady attention of his, the quality that she'd come to trust because it was never performative. He wasn't looking at her to show that he was listening. He was looking at her because he was actually trying to understand. "It's more than sufficient," he said. She shook her head slightly. "You can't know that." "I know what I've watched," he said. "Since October. I know what I saw at that market table and what I see on Tuesday mornings." He paused. "I bought your bread because it was the best bread I'd had in 20 years. That was the beginning. But what I've watched since—" He stopped himself. Started again, more carefully. "What you're building is something this territory needs and doesn't have. I've known that since November. I was waiting for you to know it." She looked at him. There was something in this conversation that was different from the other conversations they'd had in this kitchen, in this room, in the ordinary daily proximity of two people living and working in close range of each other for 4 months. She wasn't sure yet exactly what it was. She was sure enough to be careful with it. "I'll write to Pruitt tomorrow," she said. "Good," Nathan said. He poured her coffee, poured it himself, added the amount of sugar she took without asking, set it in front of her. And then he poured his own and sat at the adjacent corner of the table rather than across it, the way he'd been sitting since late January, which was a habit that had developed without comment from either of them and had simply become the shape of their evenings. They sat for a while without talking, and outside the wind had picked up again, the thaw reversing as it had threatened to, and the kitchen held its warmth against the cold the way kitchens did when they were tended correctly, and she was aware of the specific quality of the silence between them. Not empty, not waiting for anything, just present in the way that things were present between people who'd been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. The organization took a name in the first week of March, registered formally with the county as the Frontier Women's Cooperative, with Evelyn Carter as chair and Ida Marsh as secretary, which suited Ida perfectly since she'd been taking comprehensive minutes of every Tuesday session since November without being asked. It was not a dramatic moment. Reed filed the paperwork. Pruitt signed as a witness. Evelyn received a copy of the registration in the mail and put it in the back of her notebook between 2 pages of bread recipes, which was where important things lived in her system. What changed after the formal registration was not dramatic either, but it was real. Having a name meant people could look for it specifically. Pruitt referred 3 women in March. A woman who ran a post office in a settlement 25 miles north sent a letter asking if there was any possibility of a satellite Tuesday in her area, closer to the women who couldn't make the trip to Coal Ridge. Evelyn wrote back that she'd think about it, which was true, and which meant she thought about it for 2 weeks before writing back again to say yes, she could come once a month on a Saturday. The Saturday sessions meant leaving the ranch, which meant the ranch had to manage Saturday breakfast without her. The first Saturday she was scheduled to go, she spent Friday evening setting up everything she could in advance. Bread made and rested, the big pot started, everything organized so that whoever was cooking needed only to execute rather than plan. She came into the kitchen at 4:30 Saturday morning to do the final preparation and found Calhoun already there. I was standing at the stove, and he'd started the coffee, and he was looking at the notes she'd left with the expression of a man reading a map to somewhere he'd never been. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know that," he said. He looked at the stove. "My wife cooked for 30 years. I watched her do it." He looked at the notes again. "I absorbed more than I knew." She looked at him, this spare, weathered man who'd been at Coal Ridge 9 years and said what he meant, and nothing extra, and had told her once, in the most compressed possible way, that a woman had done him a kindness once, and he remembered that kind of thing. "The bread's rested," she said. "It just needs forming and the oven at the right temperature. The notes say what temperature." "I read the notes," he said. She picked up her coat. She stopped at the door. "Calhoun." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "You've said that to me before," he said. "I'll probably say it again," she said. Something moved in his face that was as close to a smile as she'd ever seen from him. "Travel safe," he said, and turned back to the stove. She went out into the dark March morning and climbed up onto the wagon seat, and Tommy Briggs was there. She hadn't asked him. He'd simply appeared with the wagon hitched. And he drove her the 25 miles north without being asked about it, talking occasionally about the horses and the spring thaw and his own plans for when the weather broke. And she listened and answered and thought about what she was going to teach that morning and what she was going to learn. Spring came to Coal Ridge with the particular decisiveness of Montana seasons. 1 week still winter, The next week, the ground softening and the sound of water running where it had been ice and the light changing to something that had warmth in it rather than just brightness. The ranch shifted into spring work, which meant longer days and different rhythms and more people moving through. And it was in that shift, on an evening in late April, when the kitchen had gone quiet and the day's work had settled and she'd put the last of the dishes away and was sitting at the table with the notebook and a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold, that Nathan came in. Not to the doorway. Into the kitchen. He sat down at the adjacent corner. His place now, that corner. Both of them had stopped noticing when it had become his place, and he put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment before he looked at her. "I want to say something," he said. She waited. He was not a man who had to work to find words. He was precise with language in the way of someone who'd learned early that imprecision caused problems. But he was working now, and she let him work. "I stopped at your table in October because the bread was the best I'd had in 20 years, he said. "That was what I told you, and it was true." He looked at his hands. "It was also true that I'd heard what happened to your bakery, and I thought someone should stop. That was in it too. I'm telling you this because I didn't tell you then, and I should have." She looked at him steadily. "It didn't change the terms," he said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I wasn't offering you the position out of charity. You were the right person for the work, and I knew that the moment I tasted that bread. But the other part was there, and you deserve to know it was there." "Why are you telling me now?" she said. He looked at her. His expression had the particular quality it had when he was deciding to be exact about something. "Because I want to say something else, and I need that to be clear first." She waited. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "When the cooperative grows into what it's going to grow into, and it will, you know it will, I don't want you to feel like you've outgrown what's here, or like the kitchen is too small for what you're building." He stopped. "I want to build something larger with you, not because you need it from me, because I want to be part of it." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a horse shifted in the corral. The stove ticked. "That's not a business proposition," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at him. This man she'd come to know in the particular intimate, ordinary way of people who shared the daily running of a place, who'd seen each other tired and frustrated and uncertain and had kept going anyway, who'd sat in this kitchen through enough evenings that the silence between them had become a kind of language. She thought about James. She thought about grief, not as a door that closed, but as a room you carried with you, and how carrying it didn't mean you couldn't walk into other rooms. She thought about what she'd said in the courthouse. "I was not weak. I had no place to stand. I have one now." "I'm not the same woman who stood at that market table," she said. "I know," Nathan said. "That's not who I'm talking to." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to need to think," she said. "I know that too," he said. He stood. He picked up her teacup, checked it, put it back. "Your tea's cold. I'll make you a fresh cup." He went to the stove. She sat at the table and watched him do it. The simple, practiced movements of a man who'd learned where things were kept in her kitchen and handled them with the same care he gave everything. And she thought that this was what it looked like. Not a declaration, not a performance of feeling, just a man making a fresh cup of tea for a woman at the end of a long day and meaning everything he'd said and waiting without pressure for her to find her way to her answer. She thought, she had not expected to find this here. She thought, she had not expected a great many things about Coal Ridge Ranch, and most of what she hadn't expected had turned out to be the things that mattered most. He set the tea in front of her and sat back down at his corner, and she picked up the cup and held it, and the evening settled around them in the way evenings at Coal Ridge settled. The specific sounds of the ranch going quiet, the stove, the wind, the distant horses. And she did not say anything yet, and he did not ask her to, and that was exactly right. She took 3 days to think. Not because she was uncertain in the way she'd been uncertain about other things, the move to the ranch, the hearing, the decision to name the cooperative, but because this was different in kind from all of those, and she wanted to be honest about what it was before she answered it. She'd learned, in the years since James died, that the most important decisions deserved the full weight of her actual attention, not the attention that was left over after she'd managed everything else. She cooked. She ran the Tuesday session, which was 16 women now, crowded enough that 2 of them had to stand near the door. She wrote in the notebook. She drove the Saturday session north and back. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings, and Nathan sat at his corner, and they talked about the ranch and the cooperative and the spring work and the ordinary things, and neither of them referenced what he'd said until she was ready, because he had said he would wait, and he meant it. On the third evening, she put down her pen and looked at him. "I need to tell you something first," she said. He looked up. "I'm not the same as I was when James died," she said. "I know that sounds obvious, but what I mean is, I spent a year after he died trying to be who I'd been when he was alive, because that felt like the only self I knew how to be. And then the bakery, and then the rented room, and somewhere in all of that I stopped being who I'd been and became someone I didn't have a name for yet." She looked at her hands on the table. "I have a name for her now, but she's not the woman James married. She's harder in some places. She doesn't trust as easily. She keeps a running account of what she can manage alone because she's learned she needs to know that." She looked at Nathan. "That's who you're talking to, not the bakery version, not the widow version, this one." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "You say that." "I mean it," he said. "The woman at the market table in October. I saw someone who had been through something serious and was still standing at a table cutting bread for people who weren't stopping. That's not the widow version. That's already this version." He looked at her directly. "She's the one I'm talking to. She's the one I've been talking to since October." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it meant to be known as the thing you'd become rather than the thing you'd been. She thought about how rare that was. She thought about Nathan's mother running the dry goods store in Ohio for 11 years, and about a man who had learned from watching her what it looked like when a woman capable of managing her own life was offered a smaller version of it and turned it down. "I'm not going to be easy," she said. "I'll want to run the cooperative the way I think it should be run. I'll want the kitchen to stay mine. There are things I've built that I'm not going to negotiate away." "I know that," Nathan said. "I'm not asking you to." "You say that now." "I'll say it in 5 years," he said. "And in 10. He paused. "I'm not a man who says things I don't intend to back up. You've had 7 months to determine that." She had. That was true. 7 months of watching him say exactly what he meant and mean exactly what he said, of watching him come to the kitchen doorway and wait rather than walk in, of watching him pour coffee and not make speeches and extend the tie-up on the south side of the barn because 20 horses needed somewhere to stand. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, what?" "Yes, I want to build something with you." She kept her eyes on him. "Not because I need you to, because I want to. That's the difference, and I need you to understand it." "I understand it," he said. "It's the only version I was asking for." She nodded once. He nodded once. It was not a romantic moment in the way that stories sometimes made those moments. There was no sweeping of things off tables, no sudden alteration of atmosphere. It was two people at a kitchen table who had both been through enough to know that what they were agreeing to was not a feeling but a direction, and that the feeling was real precisely because the direction was chosen. Nathan reached across the corner of the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, the way you marked something that mattered without turning it into a production, and then he took it back and picked up his coffee cup. "The cooperative," he said. "I've been thinking about the building problem." She looked at him. "What building problem?" 16 women in this kitchen is a building problem," he said. "There's an outbuilding on the east side, but the one we're not using for anything useful since we moved the equipment. It's sound, good roof. I'm thinking we convert it. Proper stove, real workspace, enough room for 30 people." She stared at him. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "For about 2 months," he said. "You didn't say anything." "You hadn't answered my other question yet," he said. "I didn't want to complicate it." She looked at him for a moment and then she laughed. The same unguarded laugh that had surprised her in the first weeks at the ranch, the one that came out before she could make it presentable. And Nathan looked at her with the expression she'd cataloged over 7 months as the one he had when something confirmed something he'd been quietly thinking. "Show me the outbuilding tomorrow," she said. "First thing," he said. "Bob." The outbuilding conversion took 6 weeks and involved Calhoun's structural opinions, Tommy's unexpected talent for finished carpentry that nobody, including Tommy, had known he possessed, and a considerable argument between Evelyn and the stove supplier in Black Hollow about what constituted an appropriate commercial grade range for a teaching kitchen, which Evelyn won by knowing more about stoves than the supplier and being willing to demonstrate this at length. The new space opened on a Tuesday in June. 22 women came. Evelyn stood in the converted building that morning and watched them fill it. The women she'd come to know by name, by situation, by the specific quality of their problems and their capabilities, and new faces too. Women who'd heard from other women who'd heard from others, the word having traveled its own distances in the 7 months since October. And she thought about how it had started. A market table at the end of a row. A borrowed wagon. Bread that nobody was stopping to buy. Ida Marsh was at her usual seat with her notebook open before anyone else had settled. Clara was there with her neighbor, both of them visibly more at ease than they'd been in November, with the settled quality of people who'd been through a hard winter and made it to the other side of it with their understanding of things improved. Margaret Sorrell came in with her son, the boy who invented sorting systems, who was 9 now and had, over the course of the winter, developed a habit of arriving early and asking if there was something he could do to help set up, which Evelyn had stopped refusing after the 3rd time because the help was genuine and the impulse behind it was something worth encouraging. Ruth Calloway stood near the door for a moment before she came in, the same hesitation she'd had the very first time she'd crossed the threshold of the ranch kitchen, and Evelyn caught her eye, and Ruth came in and found a seat, and that was all that needed to be said about any of it. The Patton woman was there, the one who'd come 40 miles after the hearing. She'd stayed. She'd resolved the land dispute through a process that involved Pruitt, Reed, and 4 months of patient documentation, and she'd held the claim, and she'd come to 6 Tuesday sessions since, and she sat now at the big work table with the particular posture of a woman who'd stopped asking permission to take up space. Evelyn taught that morning. She taught about summer preservation, about what to put up and how, and in what order of priority. She taught about managing a kitchen through the heat months, which was its own discipline different from winter. She talked about the notebook. She'd made copies of the core sections, Ida's idea, Ida's execution, and she gave each woman a copy, plain paper folded and stitched at the spine, nothing elaborate, everything useful. At one point mid-morning, she stopped in the middle of what she was saying because she'd caught a particular quality in the room. The sound of 22 women working and talking and asking questions, the smell of bread in the new oven, the light coming through the windows of a building that 2 months ago had held broken equipment and old rope. And she needed a moment just to let it be real. Nobody noticed. They were busy. That was exactly right. The Carter and Cole Frontier House opened in September. It had been Nathan's idea in its original form and Evelyn's in its final one, which was probably the right distribution of credit. He'd proposed a dining establishment in Black Hollow, a permanent space, a real building, a place people could come to eat rather than stopping at the ranch. And she'd agreed with the concept and then spent 3 months refining what it actually meant. Because there was a difference between a restaurant and what she was envisioning, and the difference mattered. The Frontier House was a dining establishment, yes, but it was staffed entirely by women from the cooperative, women who'd come through Tuesday sessions, who'd learned in the teaching kitchen, who needed paying work, and had the skills for it now. The kitchen was Evelyn's domain entirely. The front of the house was managed by a woman named Vera Dodd, who'd come to the cooperative in February after her husband's death, had left her with no income and considerable capability she hadn't previously had occasion to use. Nathan handled the building, the permits, the dealings with Black Hollow's commercial district, which involved a degree of patience with bureaucratic process that he possessed, and Evelyn did not. Reed reviewed the business structure. Pruitt, who had become something between an advisor and a quiet ally over the months, put in a word with 2 of the county board members who might otherwise have found reasons to complicate the permitting. Victor Harlan said nothing publicly. He was still in Black Hollow, still running his land company, still a man of influence in the territory. But the particular kind of influence that operated through implication and rumor and the slow erosion of other people's reputations had diminished, partly because the county hearing's official record existed, partly because Pruitt was not a man who forgot what he'd seen, and partly because the thing Victor had tried to stop had grown large enough that trying to stop it now would require fighting openly rather than from the margins. And Victor Harland was not a man who fought in the open. She thought about him sometimes. Not with hatred, she'd found over the months that hatred was too expensive for what it cost in attention and too cheap for what it produced. She thought about him with something more like clarity. He had done serious damage to her life, and she had not recovered from it so much as built forward from it, which was different. And the difference was important. What he destroyed hadn't been restored. It had been replaced by something that wouldn't have existed without the destruction. She couldn't be grateful for the destruction. She could acknowledge that the building had required it. She didn't say this to anyone. It was the kind of thought that sounded wrong out loud, too tidy, too resolved, even though it was true. The Frontier House opened on a Saturday in September, which was nearly a year to the day from the harvest market, where nobody had stopped. Evelyn was in the kitchen by 4 in the morning. Not because she had to be. Vera's sister and 2 other women from the cooperative were handling the setup, competent and organized and not in need of supervision, but because she'd always been up before the light when something important was happening, and she didn't see why that should change. She made cinnamon pull-apart bread. Not for the restaurant menu. It wasn't on the menu was different, suited to the establishment, but for the same reason she'd made it in every significant moment she could remember, because it was the first thing she'd mastered, the thing she'd taught herself at 14 in her mother's kitchen when she was trying to understand what it meant to make something people wanted, and it grounded her in a way nothing else quite did. She had a loaf in the oven and was starting a second batch when Nathan came into the kitchen at 5:30. He looked at the bread. "That's not on the menu," he said. "No," she said. "It's for us." He stood in the doorway for a moment. The doorway habit, the waiting, even now. And then he came in and poured coffee from the pot she'd already started and sat at the corner of the prep table, because he'd established a corner at every table they'd worked at together, she'd noticed, and she'd stopped finding it remarkable and started finding it necessary. "Are you ready?" he said. "I've been ready since October," she said. He almost smiled. She'd gotten better at reading almost over the year. I mean today specifically. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I've been ready since October," he said, which was the closest thing to a joke she'd ever heard from him, and she laughed, and he looked pleased in the particular understated way he had of looking pleased, which she'd come to understand was the same thing in him as delight in other people, just quieter. They ate the bread at the prep table before anyone else arrived. No ceremony. The morning coming up gray and cool outside the windows, the smell of bread and coffee and new wood. The building still had the smell of new construction, clean and particular, and the sound of Black Hollow waking up outside, horses and voices, and the distant sound of the mill starting its morning run. She thought about James. She did that sometimes. Thought about him at moments of arrival, not with grief exactly, more with the acknowledgement that who she'd been when she loved him had contributed to who she was now, and that the contribution was real even though he wasn't. She thought he would have liked Nathan. Not immediately. James had been cautious about people he didn't know yet. But eventually, once he'd seen how Nathan moved through the world, how he said what he meant and meant what he said, and didn't make anyone feel smaller for being near him. She didn't say any of this out loud. Some things were true without needing to be spoken. "I want to tell you something," Nathan said. She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what you said in April, that you weren't going to be easy and that the cooperative was yours," and he stopped. "I want to say that I understood that then, and I understand it now, but I also want to say something I didn't say then." "Say it," she said. "The thing I want to build with you isn't the restaurant," he said. "The restaurant is a building. What I want to build is the years. I want to be the person in the room when things go wrong, not because you need me to manage anything, but because I want to be present for the real version of your life rather than the version you'd show someone you were trying to impress." He looked at her. "I've been present for a year already. I want it to be formal, proper. Whatever word means what I mean." She looked at him across the prep table, this man who had walked into her market stall in October and bought everything she had, and offered her a kitchen and stood beside her in a courthouse, and extended a fence line and said what he meant, and waited without pressure for her to find her way to her answers. "I know what word you mean," she said. "Do you have an answer to it?" She thought about what it meant to choose something for the right reasons. Not because she was afraid of being alone. Well, she'd been alone and survived it, and knew she could continue to survive it. Not because she needed someone to manage the hard parts. She'd managed the hard parts and knew her own capacity. But because across a year of working and building and fighting and sitting in kitchens in the evening, she'd come to understand that this particular person made the world more navigable, not by removing its difficulties, but by being genuinely present in them. And that presence was a rarer thing than most people understood until they'd experienced its absence. "Yes," she said, the same yes as April, but more of it. Nathan put his hand over hers on the prep table. The same brief, unshowy gesture as April, the marking of something without making a production of it. And then he took it back and picked up his coffee. "Good," he said. Outside, the first of the kitchen staff was arriving. She could hear Vera's voice from the front of the house, directing something. The oven needed checking. There were 100 things that needed to happen before the doors opened at noon, and the Frontier House became real, in the way that things became real when other people were in them. She got up. She checked the oven. She pulled the bread out and set it to cool and started the second batch, and began the work of the morning. By noon, there was a line outside. Not a polite small-town gathering, an actual line, 15 people deep. When the doors opened, and more arriving while the first group was seated. Vera moved through the front of the house with the calm efficiency of a woman who'd discovered, at 42, that she had a gift for managing rooms full of people, and she managed it. Evelyn stayed in the kitchen. She didn't need to see the room to know how it was going. She could read it through the pace of orders, through the sounds that came back through the kitchen door, through the quality of communication between the kitchen staff. 4 women who'd come through the cooperative and who worked together with the particular ease of people who'd learned things alongside each other. Calhoun came in at 2 o'clock. He came to the kitchen, not the front of the house, which was characteristic. He stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen. The organized hum of it, the 4 women at their stations, Evelyn at the range, and he said nothing for a moment. "Well," he said. "Well," Evelyn said. He looked at the bread cooling on the rack, the cinnamon pull-apart, still there, still waiting. "Is that for the menu?" "No," she said. "That's for you, if you want it." He looked at the bread. He looked at her. Something in his face did the thing it had done the very first night she'd made cornbread, the thing that was as close as Calhoun got to being moved by something. He took a piece and ate it standing up, the way he did everything, and he said, "My wife would have loved this kitchen." "Tell me about her sometime," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a moment. "Maybe I will," he said, which from Calhoun was the equivalent of a promise. He left. She went back to the range. Tommy came in at 4 after the lunch service had wound down and the kitchen was in the interim quiet before the evening preparation started. He was growing into his face, she'd noticed over the year. The boy quality diminishing, something more settled coming in behind it. He'd been given more responsibility on the ranch through the spring and handled it with the steady capability of someone who'd been quietly building himself for exactly that. He looked at the kitchen with an expression she recognized. "My mother would have wanted to see this," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I thought about that this morning." He looked at her. "You did?" "I made apple pie in December because of her," Evelyn said. "Without knowing her at all, really, just from what you told me." She looked at him. "The people who shape us don't stop shaping us just because they're gone. She's part of what got built here. That's not nothing." Tommy was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who cried easily. He'd gotten harder in the useful way over the year, the softness finding its right place instead of just living on the surface. But his eyes went bright for a second, and he looked at the ceiling in the way young men did when they were deciding not to and managed it. "Thank you," he said. "You drove me 25 miles north on a Saturday in February," she said. "In the dark, without being asked." "That was nothing," he said. "It was everything," she said. That's what I've learned this year. Everything is made of things that look like nothing." He looked at her for a moment. This woman who'd arrived at Coal Ridge in October with a wagon full of bread and a poker face and a year and a half of hard surviving behind her. And he nodded once, the kind of nod that meant more than agreement. He went back to the ranch. She went back to the range. The harvest market came around again in October. 1 full year from the morning Victor Harland had said, "Fat widow," into the autumn air and kept walking. The Black Hollow Harvest Market was the same market it always was. The Kellner family with their preserved vegetables, Pete Strawn with his leather goods, the Dawson sisters with their quilts. The same rows, the same general configuration, the same October light that was beautiful in the specific way of things that were also cold. Evelyn had a table this year too, not at the far eastern end. Her table was in the center row, where the foot traffic ran heaviest because she'd reserved the spot in August and paid in advance, and when the market opened at 8, there was already a small crowd gathered before she'd finished setting up. She'd brought bread. Of course she had. The cinnamon pull-apart, the sourdough, the apple hand pies with the crown crimp that James had always said looked like royalty. She'd also brought copies of the cooperative's information, the Tuesday sessions, the teaching kitchen at Coal Ridge, the Frontier House address in Black Hollow, printed on good paper in Ida's careful hand. Nathan was not at the table. She hadn't asked him to be. She didn't need him at the table. I was somewhere in the market because they'd come together, but this particular table was hers and had always been hers, and that wasn't going to change. By 9 o'clock, she'd sold everything, not gradually. By 9 o'clock, there was a line, and she was working through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this 20 years. And the line didn't thin. It stayed, and then it grew because people at the back of it were stopping others to say, "Get in this line," and that was something she'd never had at a market table before. Ruth Calloway was in the line. She bought 2 loaves and a full tray of hand pies, and when she got to the front, she looked at Evelyn and said simply, "I brought my sister-in-law." Margaret Sorrell was 3 people back. She raised a hand. Evelyn raised one back. At some point, she was aware of standing in the same corner of the market where she'd stood a year ago. Not the same spot. The center row was different, but the same market, the same ground, the same October air. And the difference between the 2 moments was not something that could be named in one sentence. It was too much for one sentence. It was a year of getting up and working and teaching and fighting and sitting in kitchen evenings and building something piece by piece from what had survived being destroyed. She thought, the place hadn't changed. She had. That was what she'd said at the courthouse in December, and it was still true, and it was simpler and harder than it sounded. She thought, survival was what you did when you were in the worst of it. What came after? The building, the staying, the choosing to put your hands on the work every morning, even when the work felt like it might be pointless. That was something else. She didn't have a clean word for it. Maybe that was right. Maybe the things worth doing resisted the clean words. Nathan appeared at her elbow sometime after 9:30, when the rush had thinned enough that she had a moment to breathe. He stood beside her, not in front of the table, not behind it, but beside her, which was where he'd been since October in every way that mattered. "Everything's sold," she said. "I could see that from across the market," he said. "I didn't come over sooner because you were busy and you didn't need me." She looked at him. "I rarely need you," she said. "That's not the point." "I know," he said. "That's what I keep telling you." She looked at the empty table. She looked at the market around her, the familiar, ordinary activity of it, people moving and talking and buying and stopping and continuing, the 100 small transactions of a community taking care of itself in the way communities did when they worked the way they were supposed to. She saw Clara across the row, buying quilts from the Dawson sisters. She saw the Patton woman at the leather goods, holding up a belt, and considering it with the easy posture of a woman who was not in a hurry and not in doubt about her right to take her time. She thought about the woman who had stood at this market a year ago, cutting bread slices in the cold, telling herself just one more hour. She thought, that woman had not been wrong. She'd been in the wrong circumstances. There was a difference, and the difference had taken her a year to fully inhabit. But she was in it now. What people called strength in women who had survived hard things was usually just stubbornness plus time, plus the refusal to accept someone else's story about what you were worth. It was not glamorous. It was not the version that made good poetry. But it was real, and it compounded, and eventually it built things that lasted. She had built things that lasted. She folded her breadcloth and tucked it under her arm, and the empty table sat in the October light, and the market moved around her, and Nathan stood beside her, and somewhere across the county, Ida Marsh was keeping minutes, and Clara was managing a homestead, and Margaret's son was inventing sorting systems, and the Tuesday women were carrying what they'd learned back into their lives and putting it to use. She was not the widow people had looked past. She was not the sum of what had been taken from her. She was what she'd built from what remained, imperfect, scarred in the specific places the years had left their marks, harder in some places and softer in others than she'd been at the beginning of any of it, and still standing at a market table in the October light with work to do and people who needed what she knew and a whole life in front of her that she had not finished building. Nathan reached down and took the folded breadcloth from under her arm so she didn't have to carry it, She let him. That was enough. That was exactly enough. They walked back through the market together toward where the wagon was hitched, and the October sky was enormous above Black Hollow, the same sky that had watched all of it. And she didn't look back at the table. She already knew what was there. She was already thinking about what came next.